Negative Dialectics. Theodor W. Adorno, translated by E. B. Ashton, London and New York, original edition. Content. 2. The 3. Translator's note: this book, to begin with an admission, made me violate what I consider the number one rule for translators of philosophy: never to start translating until you think you know what the author means by every sentence. Indeed, by every word. It was done unwittingly. I had read the book in German, not too thoroughly but never unsure of its theses. I clearly recalled the thrust of what it conveys in a polished prose that had seemed eminently translatable, and so it turned out to be, not only because most of Theodor Adorno's philosophical vocabulary is of Latin or Greek stock and identical in English and German. His syntax rarely needs disentangling like that of most German philosophers since Kant. He is not as addicted to making up words as they are, and the few neologisms he does use are borrowed from English. In the early stages of translation I wondered now and then what one sentence might have to do with the preceding one and that with the one before, but other readers told of the same experience, and Adorno's own preface promised that what seemed baffling at first would be clarified later. Besides, I felt, there was no mistranslating his text. His sentences were clear. The words, his own, that is, his discussions of other men's words are a different matter, were unequivocal. Their English equivalents were beyond doubt. I plodded on, oblivious of my number one rule, but the enigmas piled up. I found myself translating entire pages without seeing how they led from the start of an argument to the conclusion. I was about to return the book as untranslatable, for me, at least, when my favorite translator's story crossed my mind. A colleague, commissioned to translate a certain book, was asked whether he had had a chance to read it yet. I do not read. I translate, was his reply. I put my nascent translation aside and did what I ought to have done in the first place. I reread Negative Dialectics, not at a fast clip, not for an overall view of the intellectual edifice, but examining brick after brick to see whether they were really thrown together helter-skelter or there was some method in the madness. I found not one method but several. Let me inject here that both ways of reading this book are legitimate. In my opinion, a writer as facile and literate as Adorno will make his points on two levels, line by line, and impression by impression. What he wants to say comes through even if you read as I first read it and as probably many of its German readers have, if you savor the nuggets of wit, the darts of sarcasm, and get the drift while floating over problems on the ripples of a style that may, at best, approximate the smoothness of the German. If you do want to get to the bottom and dig, however, there are, I believe, three keys, not to Adorno's philosophy, but to his presentation. They will unlock, not the substance of his thinking, but the formidable formal gates along the way to it. Carried in mind, they will greatly ease one's path through Negative Dialectics. The first key is the title. In his preface, Adorno calls it paradoxical, explaining that one of his aims is to rid dialectics of such traditional affirmative traits as trying to achieve something positive by way of negation. But this logical sense of negativity is not the only one in which it is here pursued. In this book the word negative has all the meanings found in an unabridged dictionary, and then some. Logical, ethical, utilitarian, political, socio-economic. It may be used, or its use may be implied, in a purely vernacular sense at one moment, and the next moment in the esoteric sense of running counter to the philosophies of identity and non-contradictoriness. It is the implied use of negative, the multitude of passages avidly hunting the thing without mentioning the word, that perplexes readers who do not keep reminding themselves of the title. Its second word also has implications beyond philosophical usage. Much of this book is dialectical in the traditional sense of Platonic, Kantian, Hegelian dialectics, but all of it is dialectics in the popular, commonplace sense of skilled argumentation. It never addresses itself to philosophical problems, always to other philosophies. There is a chapter against Heidegger, with a few swipes at Husserl and Jaspers, another against Hegel, a third against Kant. The targets cover an impressive range. Adorno spares neither idealists nor positivists of the 18th and 19th century, and he savages the neo-ontologists, intuitionists, and existentialists of the 20th. Sub rosa, he polemicizes also against the 20th century Marxist establishment, which brings us to the second of the three keys the author, Adorno, ends his preface, is prepared for the attacks to which Negative Dialectics will expose him. He feels no rancor and does not begrudge the joy of those in either camp who will proclaim that they knew it all the time and now he was confessing. The two camps, Cuban and Dribban, are East and West, Marxists and anti-Marxists. To the latter, Adorno had nothing new to confess. He had never made a secret of his convictions, but he had striven long and hard against his doubts, and when he could not repress them anymore he felt obliged to defend them. At bottom, this book is an apologia for deviationism, a Marxist thinker's explication of his inability to toe the lines laid down today for proper Marxist thinking. The deviations to which he pleads guilty are numerous. He accords primacy to facts over concepts, and to substance over form. He holds that dark realities can eclipse dazzling ideas, and that theory, however non-contradictory, cannot undo a contradictory practice. He contends that if non-identical objects belie the identity of subjectivism, even of collective subjectivism, that identity is not truth but a lie. And his defense of all this, the reason why a believer feels compelled to disavow articles of his own creed, is that the negativity of the concrete particular, of things as we see and experience them in our time, makes his a true, the Negative Dialectics. Concretely, all of these sins are epitomized in one, in the contention that history, all reinterpretations to the contrary notwithstanding, has failed to take the course predicted for it as a scientific necessity. Directly following the preface, the book itself opens with a flat statement of this cardinal heresy. Philosophy, which once seemed obsolete, lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. The summary judgment that it had merely interpreted the world, that resignation in the face of reality had crippled it in itself, becomes a defeatism of reason after the attempt to change the world miscarried. Two sentences one may be at a loss to understand unless he remembers Marx's famous dictum about the philosophers who were content to interpret the world. What matters is to change it. What matters here is the third key to reading this book. It overflows with such allusions, with paraphrases of renowned and not so renowned quotations from men presupposed as familiar. Adorno has several ways of handling these. The original may be quoted at length, in the text or in footnotes, leaving the parallel to be figured out by the reader. All the authors, modern ones in particular, are named, assuming only that the reader will know them sufficiently to understand what specific line or aspect of their work is here referred to, but sometimes such aids are dispensed with altogether, on the assumption that whoever reads Negative Dialectics will instantly have the source in mind. The last procedure, I believe, will be responsible for most of the problems one may have in reading. It certainly was responsible for most of mine. To follow the line of thought from detail to detail, you need to know Kant near perfectly, Hegel perfectly, and Marx, Engels viscerally, not just by heart. If you twitch whenever a phrase in this book resembles one from the Marxist founding fathers, then and not until then can you think along with Adorno. Besides, you should have a working knowledge of moderns from a variety of fields, of such philosophers as Bergson, Husserl, Hegel, Schiller, Walter Benjamin, an anthology of whose work has lately appeared in English into maybe the one object of Adorno's unqualified admiration, of prominent sociologists and psychiatrists, of seminal poets, Beckett, and composers, Schoenberg. Adorno is not only a philosopher but one of the most knowledgeable musicologists of our time, and you should at least have heard of Karl Kraus of Vienna, the consummate intellectual and jack of all literary trades whose influence covered the German language area after the First World War and had a revival of sorts after the Second. You do not need to know Heidegger. The principal target of Adorno's polemics is the only one where he presupposes nothing, where every line he scorns is quoted in full, preliminary to dissection. The duels with Heidegger in the first half of this book will not stump the reader, as a rule, although some did stump the translator, for Martin Heidegger has always struck me as untranslatable, and despite the talent and effort invested in recent English versions of his works, he still does. He is a man who chose to put the gist of his philosophizing into the form of an argument with language. Being a German, he argues with the German language. To reproduce his plays on German words, his translators invented ingenious English words and word combinations, but the very point of the method is that in the source language the words are neither ingenious nor invented. Like the means used to vary them, they are all commonplace, almost all Germanic, and carefully selected for both traits. Heidegger's most abstruse texts can be skimmed with a sense of familiarity by German readers, and this plays a major role in the philosophy. That a vocabulary of linguistic oddities will not produce the same illusion is clear. With Heidegger, time and again, there is simply no way to the equivalence that is the crux of translation. In 2 or 3 such cases, therefore, a few lines of the original have been omitted from this volume. They are not vital, merely reinforcing other exemplifications of the same points, and the alternative, to quote the German and to append footnotes with a translation bound to miss the point, an explanation of the inadequacy, and a further explanation of Adorno's comments on the mistranslated quotes, seem to me too horrible to contemplate. The passages Adorno quotes or paraphrases from Kant, Hegel, or Marx Engels posed a different problem. There are many Kant translations and some excellent ones, but in the concrete case their wording would not often lend itself to the Adorno variations. There are not many good Hegel translations, though the Josiah Royce version of Die Vernunft und der Geschichte, a work analyzed extensively in this book, ranks with the best. Looking forward to this chance to draw upon the late Professor Royce's English, I spent hours searching for his rendering of every quoted line. In vain, most of them were undiscoverable. To capture Hegel's spirit, the translator has stripped away the weak Hegelian flesh, but it is the flesh, unfortunately, that Adorno picks on. The official, canonical English version of the works of Marx and Engels is in the opposite category. The flesh is there, but the spirit is that of the Leninist revision. The greatest translations have not escaped from such ideological service. After all, in one of our English Bibles the Christmas message promises goodwill toward men while the other limits it to men of goodwill. In the standard English Marx Engels, the original tenets are ever so slightly nudged in the direction of meanings given to them. As Adorno's heretical opening puts it, after the attempt to change the world miscarried, 3 little words repeated over and over in this book, nach wie vor, now as before, keep us mindful of that miscarriage. Finally, it should be noted that each of these wellsprings of thought has its own variant of German philosophical usage, its own somewhat different understanding of the same terms, and that in English each new translation led inevitably to new differences within Hegel. For instance, besides adding to the original ones between Hegel and others, in negative dialectics the consistent use of existing translations would have produced an unintelligible hodgepodge. What I decided to do instead, after much soul-searching, was to orient my work to the manner I was translating. Wherever someone else is quoted, paraphrased, discussed, or alluded to, I was take Adorno's terminology, construction, and meaning as the base on which to synthesize my own renderings of the texts he refers to, regardless of how they may have been rendered elsewhere. It was he, after all, who dealt with them, who reasoned and argued with them, and here, to my mind, these dealings rather than their objects are of the essence. My responsibility, as I saw it, was to put Adorno's thought into English, not to keep his examples of other philosophers' thought in line with the English forms lent to them by other translators. If a reader has studied the German thinkers in English and fails to find here the expressions he has come to be familiar with, I ask him to remember that this is Adorno's book, and to take my word for it that a comparison with the original text of the others will show that they were translated faithfully. I often wonder. A noted translator and critic wrote to me years ago, how far writers like Benjamin, Locke, Adorno, say, are ever going to make much mark in the English speaking world, as long as translators do not risk their lives and think them into English. What does the reader with a quite different philosophical background, and often very little philosophical background of any sort, really make of them for readers with no philosophical background of any sort? I am afraid the answer has to be, not much, in any language, and Locke and Benjamin may indeed force a translator to take his life in his hands even for a well-trained audience. But I like to believe that Adorno, who often seems to do his own thinking in English, requires no such favor. If you are aware that he is defending himself against attacks from either camp, if you recall that his armor is a dialectics built on relentless pursuit of the negative in every possible sense, and if you know the philosophies he uses, negatively, as a rule, for his concretions and models, the encounter with his anti-system, as the German book jacket calls it, may prove a challenging and intriguing experience, even, I hope, in English. EBA, negative, dialectics, preface. Negative dialectics is a phrase that flouts tradition. As early as Plato, dialectics meant to achieve something positive by means of negation. The thought figure of a negation later became the succinct term. This book seeks to free dialectics from such affirmative traits without reducing its determinacy. The unfoldment of the paradoxical title is one of its aims. What would be the foundation, according to the dominant view of philosophy, will here be developed long after the author has discussed things of which that view assumes that they grow out of a foundation. This implies a critique of the foundation concept as well as the primacy of substantive thought, a thought to whose movement the thinker becomes aware only as he performs it. What it needs is secondary under the rules of the intellectual game, which always remain applicable. A methodology of the author's material works is not all there is to this book. No continuum exists between those works and it, according to the theory of negative dialectics. The discontinuity will be dealt with, however, and so will the directions for thought to be read in it. The procedure will be justified, not based on reasons. To the best of his ability the author means to put his cards on the table, which is by no means the same as playing the game. In 1937, when the author had completed his Metacritic der Erkenntnis theory, the last chapter of that publication moved Walter Benjamin to remark that one had to cross a frozen waste of abstraction to arrive at concise, concrete philosophizing. Negative dialectics now charts such a crossing in retrospect. In contemporary philosophy, concretion would mostly be obtained on the sly. By contrast, this largely abstract text seeks no less to serve authentic concretion than to explain the author's concrete procedure, as the latest aesthetic discussions feature the anti-drama and the anti-hero. This negative dialectics in which all aesthetic topics are shunned might be called an anti-system. It attempts by means of logical consistency to substitute for the unity principle, and for the paramountcy of the supraordinated concept, the idea of what would be outside the sway of such unity, to use the strength of the subject to break through the fallacy of constitutive subjectivity. This is what the author felt to be his task ever since he came to trust his own mental impulses. Now he did not wish to put it off any longer. Stringently to transcend the official separation of pure philosophy and the substantive or formally scientific realm was one of his determining motives. The introduction expounds the concept of philosophical experience. Part 1 starts out from the current state of the ontology reigning in Germany, rather than judged from above. This ontology is understood and imminently criticized out of the need for it, which is a problem of its own. From the results, Part 2 proceeds to the idea of a negative dialectics and to its position on several categories which are retained as well as qualitatively altered. Part 3 elaborates models of negative dialectics. They are not examples. They do not simply elucidate general reflections, guiding into the substantive realm. They seek simultaneously to do justice to the topical intention of what has initially, of necessity, been generally treated, as opposed to the use of examples which Plato introduced and philosophy repeated ever since, as matters of indifference in themselves. The models are to make plain what negative dialectics is and to bring it into the realm of reality, in line with its own concept. At the same time, not unlike the so-called exemplary method, they serve the purpose of discussing key concepts of philosophical disciplines and centrally intervening in those disciplines. For philosophical ethics this will be done by a dialectics of freedom, and for the philosophy of history, by world spirit and natural history. The last chapter, groping its way around metaphysical questions, tries by critical self-reflection to give the Copernican revolution an axle turn. The author is prepared for the attacks to which negative dialectics will expose him. He feels no rancor and does not begrudge the joy of those in either camp who will proclaim that they knew it all the time and now he was confessing. Frankfurter Main Summer 1966. Theodor W. Adorno. Introduction. The possibility of philosophy, which once seemed obsolete, lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. The summary judgment that it had merely interpreted the world, that resignation in the face of reality had crippled it in itself, becomes a defeatism of reason after the attempt to change the world miscarried. Philosophy offers no place from which theory as such might be concretely convicted of the anachronisms it is suspected of, now as before. Perhaps it was an inadequate interpretation which promised that it would be put into practice. Theory cannot prolong the moment its critique depended on. A practice indefinitely delayed is no longer the forum for appeals against self-satisfied speculation. It is mostly the pretext used by executive authorities to choke, as vain, whatever critical thoughts the practical change would require. Having broken its pledge to be as one with reality or at the point of realization, philosophy is obliged ruthlessly to criticize itself. Once upon a time, compared with sense perception and every kind of external experience, it was felt to be the very opposite of naivete. Now it has objectively grown as naive in its turn as the seedy scholars feasting on subjective speculation seemed to Goethe, 150 years ago. The introverted thought architect dwells behind the moon that is taken over by extroverted technicians. The conceptual shells that would to house the whole, according to philosophical custom, have in view of the immense expansion of society and of the strides made by positive natural science come to seem like relics of a simple barter economy amidst the late stage of industrial capitalism. The discrepancy since decayed into a commonplace between power and any sort of spirit has grown so vast as to foil whatever attempts to understand the preponderance might be inspired by the spirit's own concept. The will to this understanding bespeaks a power claim denied by that which is to be understood. The most patent expression of philosophy's historical fate is the way the special sciences compelled it to turn back into a special science. If Kant had, as he put it, freed himself from the school concept of philosophy for its world concept, one it has now, perforce, regressed to its school concept. Whenever philosophers mistake that for the world concept, their pretensions grow ridiculous. Hegel, despite his doctrine of the absolute spirit in which he included philosophy, knew philosophy as a mere element of reality, an activity in the division of labor, and thus restricted it. This has since led to the narrowness of philosophy, to a disproportionateness to reality that became the more marked the more thoroughly philosophers forgot about the restriction, the more they disdained, as alien, any thought of their position in a whole which they monopolized as their object, instead of recognizing how much they depended on it all the way to the internal composition of their philosophy, to its immanent truth. To be worth another thought, philosophy must rid itself of such naivete, but its critical self-reflection must not halt before the highest peaks of its history. Its task would be to inquire whether and how there can still be a philosophy at all, now that Hegel's has fallen, just as Kant inquired into the possibility of metaphysics after the critique of rationalism. If Hegel's dialectics constituted the unsuccessful attempt to use philosophical concepts for coping with all that is heterogeneous to those concepts, the relationship to dialectics is due for an accounting insofar as his attempt failed. Dialectics not a standpoint. No theory today escapes the marketplace. Each one is offered as a possibility among competing opinions. All are put up for choice. All are swallowed. There are no blinders for thought to don against this, and the self-righteous conviction that my own theory is spared that fate will surely deteriorate into self-advertising. But neither need dialectics be muted by such rebuke, or by the concomitant charge of its superfluity, of being a method slapped on outwardly, at random. The name of dialectics says no more, to begin with, than that objects do not go into their concepts without leaving a remainder, that they come to contradict the traditional norm of adequacy. Contradiction is not what Hegel's absolute idealism was bound to transfigure it into. It is not of the essence in a Heraclitean sense. It indicates the untruth of identity, the fact that the concept does not exhaust the thing conceived, yet the appearance of identity is inherent in thought itself, in its pure form. To think is to identify. Conceptual order is content to screen what thinking seeks to comprehend. The semblance and the truth of thought entwine. The semblance cannot be decreed away, as by avowal of a being in itself outside the totality of cogitative definitions. It is a thesis secretly implied by Kant, and mobilized against him by Hegel, that the transconceptual in itself is weight, being wholly indefinite, aware that the conceptual totality is mere appearance. I have no way but to break immanently, in its own measure, through the appearance of total identity, since that totality is structured to accord with logic, however, whose core is the principle of the excluded middle. Whatever will not fit this principle, whatever differs in quality, comes to be designated as a contradiction. Contradiction is non non-identity under the aspect of identity. The dialectical primary of the principle of contradiction makes the thought of unity the measure of heterogeneity. As the heterogeneous collides with its limit, it exceeds itself. Dialectics is the consistent sense of non-identity. It does not begin by taking a standpoint. My thought is driven to it by its own inevitable insufficiency, by my guilt of what I am thinking. We are blaming the method for the fault of the matter when we object to dialectics on the ground, repeated from Hegel's Aristotelian critics on 2, that whatever happens to come into the dialectical mill will be reduced to the merely logical form of contradiction, and that the full diversity of the non-contradictory, of that which is simply differentiated, will be ignored. What we differentiate will appear divergent, dissonant, negative for just as long as the structure of our consciousness obliges it to strive for unity, as long as its demand for totality will be its measure for whatever is not identical with it. This is what dialectics holds up to our consciousness as a contradiction. Because of the immanent nature of consciousness, contradictoriness itself has an inescapably and fatefully legal character. Identity and contradiction of thought are welded together. Total contradiction is nothing but the manifested untruth of total identification. Contradiction is non-identity under the rule of a law that affects the non-identical as well. Reality and dialectics. This law is not a cogitative law, however. It is real. Unquestionably, one who submits to the dialectical discipline has to pay dearly in the qualitative variety of experience. Still, in the administered world, the impoverishment of experience by dialectics, which outrages healthy opinion, proves appropriate to the abstract monotony of that world. Its agony is the world's agony raised to a concept. Cognition must bow to it, unless concretion is once more to be debased into the ideology it starts becoming in fact. Another version of dialectics contented itself with a debilitated renaissance, with its intellectual historical derivation from Kant's Aparius and from that which the systems of his successors projected but failed to achieve. It can be achieved only negatively. Dialectics unfolds the difference between the particular and the universal, dictated by the universal. As the subject-object dichotomy is brought to mind, it becomes inescapable for the subject, furrowing whatever the subject thinks, even objectively, but it would come to an end in reconcilement. Reconcilement would release the non-identical, would rid it of coercion, including spiritualized coercion. It would open the road to the multiplicity of different things and strip dialectics of its power over them. Reconcilement would be the thought of the many as no longer inimical, a thought that is anathema to subjective reason. Dialectics serves the end of reconcilement. It dismantles the coercive logical character of its own course. That is why it is denounced as panlogism. As idealistic dialectics, it was bracketed with the absolute subject's predominance as the negative impulse of each single move of the concept and of its course as a whole. Historically, such primacy of the subject has been condemned even in the Hegelian conception that eclipsed the individual human consciousness as well as the transcendental one of Kant and Fichte. Subjective primacy was not only supplanted by the impotence of a weakening thought, which the world's overpowering course deters from construing it, but none of the reconcilements claimed by absolute idealism, and no other kind remained consistent, has stood up, whether in logic or in politics and history. The inability of consistent idealism to constitute itself as anything but the epitome of contradiction is as much the logical consequence of its truth as it is the punishment incurred by its logicity qua logicity. It is appearance as much as necessity. Yet reopening the case of dialectics, whose non-idealistic form has since degenerated into a dogma as its idealistic one did into a cultural asset, will not decide solely about the actuality of a traditional mode of philosophizing, nor about the actuality of the philosophical structure of cognitive objects. Through Hegel, philosophy had regained the right and the capacity to think substantively instead of being put off with the analysis of cognitive forms that were empty and, in an emphatic sense, null and void. Where present philosophy deals with anything substantive at all, it lapses either into the randomness of a Weltanschauung or into that formalism, that matter of indifference, against which Hegel had risen. There is historical evidence of this in the evolution of phenomenology, which once was animated by the need for content and became an invocation of being. A repudiation of any content as unclean. The fundament and result of Hegel's substantive philosophizing was the primacy of the subject, or, in the famous phrase from the introduction to his logic, the identity of identity and non-identity. For he held the definite particular to be definable by the mind because its immanent definition was to be nothing but the mind. Without this supposition, according to Hegel, philosophy would be incapable of knowing anything substantive or essential, unless the idealistically acquired concept of dialectics harbors experiences contrary to the Hegelian emphasis. Experience is independent of the idealistic machinery. Philosophy must inevitably do without substantive insight, confine itself to the methodology of science, call that philosophy, and virtually cross itself out. The concern of philosophy, the matters of true philosophical interest at this point in history are those in which Hegel, agreeing with tradition, expressed his disinterest. They are non-conceptuality, individuality, and particularity, things which ever since Plato used to be dismissed as transitory and insignificant, and which Hegel labeled lazy existence. Philosophy's theme would consist of the qualities it downgrades as contingent, as a quantity negligible. A matter of urgency to the concept would be what it fails to cover, what its abstractionist mechanism eliminates, what is not already a case of the concept. Bergson and Husserl, carriers of philosophical modernism, both have innovated this idea but withdrawn from it to traditional metaphysics. Bergson, in a tour de force, created another type of cognition for non-conceptuality's sake. The dialectical soul was washed away in an undifferentiated tide of life. Solidified reality was disposed of as subaltern, not comprehended along with its subalternity. The hater of the rigid general concept established a cult of irrational immediacy, of sovereign freedom in the midst of unfreedom. He drafted his two cognitive modes in as dualistic an opposition as that of the Cartesian and Kantian doctrines he fought had ever been. The causal mechanical mode, as pragmatistic knowledge, was no more affected by the intuitive one than the bourgeois establishment was by the relaxed unself-consciousness of those who owe their privileges to that establishment. The celebrated intuitions themselves seem rather abstract in Bergson's philosophy. They scarcely go beyond the phenomenal time consciousness which even Kant had underlying chronological physical time, spatial time, according to Bergson's insight. Although it takes an effort to develop, the intuitive mode of mental conduct does continue to exist in fact as an archaic rudiment of mimetic reactions. What preceded its past holds a promise beyond the ossified present. Intuitions succeed only desultorily, however. Every cognition including Bergson's own needs the rationality he scorns, and needs it precisely at the moment of concretion. Absolutized duration, pure becoming, the pure act, these would recoil into the same timelessness which Bergson chides in metaphysics since Plato and Aristotle. He did not mind that the thing he groped for, if it is not to remain a mirage, is visible solely with the equipment of cognition, by reflection upon its own means, and that it grows arbitrary in a procedure unrelated, from the start, to that of cognition. Husserl the logician, on the other hand, would indeed sharply distinguish the mode of apprehending the essence from generalizing abstraction. What he had in mind was a specific mental experience capable of perceiving the essence of the particular, but the essence to which this experience referred did not differ in any respect from the familiar general concepts. There is a glaring discrepancy between the arrangements of essence perception and its terminus ad quem. Neither attempt to break out of idealism was successful. Bergson's bearings, like those of his positivist arch-enemies, came from the Données immédiates de la conscience. Husserl's came in similar fashion from phenomena of the stream of consciousness. Both men stay within range of immanent subjectivity. 5 to be insisted upon, against both, would be the goal they pursue in vain. To counter Wittgenstein by uttering the unutterable, the plain contradictoriness of this challenge is that of philosophy itself, which is thereby qualified as dialectics before getting entangled in its individual contradictions. The work of philosophical self-reflection consists in unraveling that paradox. Everything else is signification, second-hand construction, pre-philosophical activity. Today as in Hegel's time, though doubtful as ever, a confidence that philosophy can make it after all, that the concept can transcend the concept, the preparatory and concluding element, and can thus reach the non-conceptual, is one of philosophy's inalienable features and part of the naivete that ails it. Otherwise it must capitulate, and the human mind with it. We could not conceive the simplest operation. There would be no truth. Emphatically, everything would be just nothing. But whatever truth the concepts cover beyond their abstract range can have no other stage than what the concepts suppress, disparage, and discard. The cognitive utopia would be to use concepts to unseal the non-conceptual with concepts, without making it their equal, the antagonistic entirety. Such a concept of dialectics makes us doubt its possibility. However varied, the anticipation of moving in contradictions throughout seems to teach a mental totality, the very identity thesis we have just rendered inoperative. The mind which ceaselessly reflects on contradiction in the thing itself, we hear, must be the thing itself if it is to be organized in the form of contradiction. The truth which an idealistic dialectics drives beyond every particular, as one-sided and wrong, is the truth of the whole, and if that were not preconceived, the dialectical steps would lack motivation and direction. We have to answer that the object of a mental experience is an antagonistic system in itself, antagonistic in reality, not just in its conveyance to the knowing subject that rediscovers itself therein. The coercive state of reality, which idealism had projected into the region of the subjects in the mind, must be retranslated from that region. What remains of idealism is that society, the objective determinant of the mind, is as much an epitome of subjects as it is their negation. In society the subjects are unknowable and incapacitated, hence its desperate objectivity and conceptuality, which idealism mistakes for something positive. The system is not one of the absolute spirit, it is one of the most conditioned spirit of those who have it and cannot even know how much it is their own. The subjective preconception of the material production process in society, basically different from its theoretical constitution, is the unresolved part, the part irreconciled with the subjects. Their own reason, unconscious like the transcendental subjects and establishing identity by barter, remains incommensurable with the subjects it reduces to the same denominator. The subject is the subject's foe. The preceding generality is both true and untrue. True, because it forms that ether which Hegel calls spirit, and true, because its reason is no reason yet, because its universality is the product of particular interests. This is why a philosophical critique of identity transcends philosophy. But the ineffable part of the utopia is that what defies subsumption under identity, the use value, in Marxist terminology, is necessary anyway if life is to go on at all, even under the prevailing circumstances of production. The utopia extends to the sworn enemies of its realization. Regarding the concrete utopian possibility, dialectics is the ontology of the wrong state of things. The right state of things would be free of it, neither a system nor a contradiction. Disenchantment of the concept, philosophy, Hegel's included, invites the general objection that by inevitably having concepts for its material it anticipates an idealistic decision. In fact no philosophy, not even extreme empiricism, can drag in the facta bruta and present them like cases in anatomy or experiments in physics. No philosophy can paste the particulars into the text, as seductive paintings would hoodwink it into believing. But the argument in its formality and generality takes as fetishistic a view of the concept as the concept does in interpreting itself naively in its own domain. In either case it is regarded as a self-sufficient totality over which philosophical thought has no power. In truth, all concepts, even the philosophical ones, refer to non-conceptualities, because concepts on their part are moments of the reality that requires their formation, primarily for the control of nature. What conceptualization appears to be from within, to one engaged in it, the predominance of its sphere, without which nothing is known, must not be mistaken for what it is in itself. Such a semblance of being in itself is conferred upon it by the motion that exempts it from reality, to which it is harnessed in turn. Necessity compels philosophy to operate with concepts, but this necessity must not be turned into the virtue of their priority, no more than, conversely, criticism of that virtue can be turned into a summary verdict against philosophy. On the other hand, the insight that philosophy's conceptual knowledge is not the absolute of philosophy, this insight, for all its inescapability, is again due to the nature of the concept. It is not a dogmatic thesis, much less a naively realistic one. Initially, such concepts as that of being at the start of Hegel's logic emphatically mean non-conceptualities. As Lask put it, they mean beyond themselves, dissatisfaction with their own conceptuality as part of their meaning, although the inclusion of non-conceptuality in their meaning makes it tendentially their equal and thus keeps them trapped within themselves. The substance of concepts is to them both immanent, as far as the mind is concerned, and transcendent as far as being is concerned. To be aware of this is to be able to get rid of concept fetishism. Philosophical reflection makes sure of the non-conceptual in the concept. It would be empty otherwise. According to Kant's dictum, in the end, having ceased to be a concept of anything at all, it would be nothing. A philosophy that lets us know this, that extinguishes the autarky of the concept, strips the blindfold from our eyes, that the concept is a concept even when dealing with things in being does not change the fact that on its part it is entwined with a non-conceptual whole. Its only insulation from that whole is its reification, that which establishes it as a concept. The concept is an element in dialectical logic, like any other. What survives in it is the fact that non-conceptuality has conveyed it by way of its meaning, which in turn establishes its conceptuality. To refer to non-conceptualities, as ultimately, according to traditional epistemology, every definition of concepts requires non-conceptual, dialectic elements, is characteristic of the concept, and so is the contrary, that as the abstract unit of the noumenous subsumed thereunder it will depart from the nominal. To change this direction of conceptuality, to give it a turn toward non-identity, is the hinge of negative dialectics. Insight into the constitutive character of the non-conceptual in the concept would end the compulsive identification which the concept brings unless halted by such reflection. Reflection upon its own meaning is the way out of the concept seeming being in itself as a unit of meaning infinity. Disenchantment enchantment of the concept is the antidote of philosophy. It keeps it from growing rampant and becoming an absolute to itself. An idea bequeathed to us by idealism, and corrupted by it, more than any other, needs a change in its function, the idea of the infinite. It is not up to philosophy to exhaust things according to scientific usage, to reduce a phenomena to a minimum of propositions. There are hints of that in Hegel's polemic against Fichte, whom he accused of starting out with a dictum. Instead, in philosophy we literally seek to immerse ourselves in things that are heterogeneous to it, without placing those things in prefabricated categories. We want to adhere as closely to the heterogeneous as the programs of phenomenology and of Simmel tried in vain to do. Our aim is total self-relinquishment. Philosophical contents can only be grasped where philosophy does not impose them. The illusion that it might confine the essence in its finite definitions will have to be given up. The fatal ease with which the word infinite rolled off the idealistic philosophers' tongues may have been due only to a wish to allay gnawing doubts about the meager finiteness of their conceptual machinery, including Hegel's, his intentions notwithstanding. Traditional philosophy thinks of itself as possessing an infinite object, and in that belief it becomes a finite, conclusive philosophy. A changed philosophy would have to cancel that claim, to cease persuading others and itself that it has the infinite at its disposal. Instead, if it were delicately understood, the changed philosophy itself would be infinite in the sense of scorning solidification in a body of innumerable theorems. Its substance would lie in the diversity of objects that impinge upon it and of the objects it seeks, a diversity not wrought by any schema. To those objects, philosophy would truly give itself rather than use them as a mirror in which to reread itself, mistaking its own image for concretion. It would be nothing but full, unreduced experience of the medium of conceptual reflection, whereas even the science of empirical consciousness reduced the contents of such experience to cases of categories. What makes philosophy risk the strain of its own infinity is the unwarranted expectation that each individual and particular puzzle it solves will be like Leibniz's monad, the ever-elusive entirety in itself, although, of course, in line with a pre-established disharmony rather than a pre-established harmony. The metacritical turn against the prima philosophia is at the same time a turn against the finiteness of a philosophy that prates about infinity without respecting it. No object is wholly known. Knowledge is not supposed to prepare the phantasm of a whole. Thus the goal of a philosophical interpretation of works of art cannot be their identification with the concept, their absorption in the concept, yet it is through such interpretation that the truth of the work unfolds. What can be envisioned, however, whether as the regularly continued abstraction or as an application of the concepts to whatever comes under their definition, may be useful as technology in the broadest sense of the word, but to philosophy, which refuses to fit in, it is irrelevant. In principle, philosophy can always go astray, which is the sole reason why it can go forward. This has been recognized in skepticism and in pragmatism, most recently in Dewey's wholly humane version of the latter, but we ought to add it as a ferment to an emphatic philosophy instead of renouncing philosophy, from the outset, in favor of the test it has to stand. As a corrective to the total rule of method, philosophy contains a playful element which the traditional view of it as a science would like to exorcise. For Hegel, too, this was a sensitive point. He rejects types and distinctions determined by external chance and by play, not by reason. 6. The unnaive thinker knows how far he remains from the object of his thinking, and yet he must always talk as if he had it entirely. This brings him to the point of clowning. He must not deny his clownish traits, least of all since they alone can give him hope for what is denied him. Philosophy is the most serious of things, but then again it is not all that serious. A thing that aims at what it is not a priori and is not authorized to control. Such a thing, according to its own concept, is simultaneously part of a sphere beyond control, a sphere tabooed by conceptuality. To represent the mimesis it supplanted, the concept has no other way than to adopt something mimetic in its own conduct, without abandoning itself. The aesthetic moment is thus not accidental to philosophy, though on grounds quite different from Schelling's, but it is no less incumbent upon philosophy to void its aestheticism, to sublimate the aesthetic into the real, by cogent insights. Cogency and play are the two poles of philosophy. Its affinity to art does not entitle it to borrow from art, least of all by virtue of the intuitions which barbarians take for the prerogatives of art. Intuitions hardly ever strike in isolation, as lightning from above. They do not strike the artist's work like that either. They hang together with the formal law of the work. If one tried to extract and preserve them, they would dissolve. Finally, thought is no protector of springs whose freshness might deliver us from thinking. We have no type of cognition at our disposal that differs absolutely from the disposing type, the type which intuitionism flees in panic and in vain. A philosophy that tried to imitate art, that would turn itself into a work of art, would be expunging itself. It would be postulating the demand for identity, claiming to exhaust its object by endowing its procedure with a supremacy to which the heterogeneous bows a priori, as material, whereas to genuine philosophy its relation to the heterogeneous is virtually thematic. Common to art and philosophy is not the form, not the forming process, but a mode of conduct that forbids pseudomorphosis. Both keep faith with their own substance through their opposites, art by making itself resistant to its meanings, philosophy, by refusing to clutch at any immediate thing. What the philosophical concept will not abandon is the yearning that animates the non-conceptual side of art, and whose fulfillment shuns the immediate side of art as mere appearance. The concept, the organ of thinking, and yet the wall between thinking and the thought, negates that yearning. Philosophy can neither circumvent such negation nor submit to it. It must strive, by way of the concept, to transcend the concept, the speculative moment. Even after breaking with idealism, philosophy cannot do without speculation, which was exalted by idealism and tabooed with it, meaning speculation, of course, in a sense broader than the overly positive Hegelian one. For positivists it is not difficult to attribute speculation to Marxian materialism, which starts out from laws of objective being, by no means from immediate data or protocol statements. To cleanse himself of the suspicion of ideology, it is now safer for a man to call Marx a metaphysician than to call him a class enemy, but the safe ground is a phantasm where the claims of truth demand that one rise above it. Philosophy is not to be put off with theorems that would talk it out of its essential concern instead of satisfying that concern, albeit with a no. In the counter-movements to Kant, from the 19th century on, this was sensed but always compromised again by obscurantism. The resistance of philosophy needs to unfold, however, even in music, as in all art. Presumably, the impulse animating the first bar will not be fulfilled at once, but only in further articulation. To this extent, however much it may be phenomenal as a totality, music is a critique of phenomenality, of the appearance that the substance is present here and now. Such a mediate role befits philosophy no less. When it presumes to say things forthwith, it invites Hegel's verdict on empty profundity. Mouthing profundities will no more make a man profound than narrating the metaphysical views of its characters will make a novel metaphysical. To ask philosophy to deal with the question of being, or with other cardinal themes of Western metaphysics, shows a primitive moreover. Topical faith. The objective worth of those themes is indeed inescapable in philosophy, but neither can we rely on our ability to cope with the great topics. We must be so wary of the beaten tracks of philosophical reflection that our emphatic interest will seek refuge in ephemeral objects not yet overdetermined by intentions. Though chained to the questions of traditional philosophical problematics, we certainly must negate that problematics. A world that is objectively set for totality will not release the human consciousness, will ceaselessly fasten it to points it wants to get away from, but a thinking that blithely begins afresh, heedless of the historic form of its problems, will so much more be their prey. That philosophy shares in the idea of depth is due to its cogitative breadth alone. A prime example from the modern age is the Kantian deduction of pure intellectual concepts, which the author, with abysmally apologetic irony, called somewhat profoundly arranged. 7. Profundity, as Hegel did not fail to note, is another element of dialectics, not an isolated trait. A dreadful German tradition equates profound thoughts with thoughts ready to swear by the theodicy of death and evil. A theological terminus ad quem is tacitly passed over and passed under, as if the worth of a thought were decided by its result, the confirmation of transcendence, or by its immersion in inwardness, its sheer being for itself, as if withdrawal from the world were flatly tantamount to consciousness of the world ground. As for the phantasms of profundity, which in the history of the human spirit have always been well disposed toward an existing state of affairs they find insipid, resistance would be their true measure. The power of the status quo puts up the facades into which our consciousness crashes. It must seek to crash through them. This alone would free the postulate of depth from ideology. Surviving in such resistance is the speculative moment. What will not have its law prescribed for it by given facts transcends them even in the closest contact with the objects, and in repudiating a sacrosanct transcendence. Where the thought transcends the bonds it tied in resistance, there is its freedom. Freedom follows the subject's urge to express itself. The need to lend a voice to suffering is a condition of all truth. For suffering is objectivity that weighs upon the subject. Its most subjective experience, its expression, is objectively conveyed. Presentation. This may help to explain why the presentation of philosophy is not an external matter of indifference to it but immanent to its idea. Its integral, non-conceptually mimetic moment of expression is objectified only by presentation in language. The freedom of philosophy is nothing but the capacity to lend a voice to its unfreedom. If more is claimed for the expressive moment, it will degenerate into a Weltanschauung, where the expressive moment and the duty of presentation are given up. Philosophy comes to resemble science. To philosophy, expression and stringency are not two dichotomous possibilities. They need each other. Neither one can be without the other. Expression is relieved of its accidental character by thought, on which it toils as thought toils on expression. Only an expressed thought is succinct, rendered succinct by its presentation in language. What is vaguely put is poorly thought. Expression compels stringency in what it expresses. It is not an end in itself at the latter's expense. Rather, expression removes the expressed from the materialized mischief which in its turn is an object of philosophical criticism. Speculative philosophy without an idealistic substructure requires observance of stringency to break the authoritarian power claim of stringency. Benjamin, whose original draft of his passage theory combined incomparable speculative skill with micrological proximity to factual contents, later remarked in a correspondence about the first properly metaphysical stratum of this work that it could be accomplished only as an impermissible poetic one. 8. The submission of surrender denotes as much the difficulty of a philosophy loath to decline as the point at which its concept can be carried further. It was probably due to Benjamin's acceptance of dialectical materialism as a Weltanschauung, so to speak, with closed eyes. But the fact that he could not bring himself to put the definitive version of the passage theory in writing reminds us that philosophy is more than bustle only where it runs the risk of total failure. This in reply to the absolute certainty that has traditionally been obtained by stealth. Benjamin's defeatism about his own thought was conditioned by the undialectical positivity of which he carried a formerly unchanged remnant from his theological phase into his materialistic phase. By comparison, Hegel's equating negativity with the thought that keeps philosophy from both the positivity of science and the contingency of dilettantism has empirical substance. Thought as such, before all particular contents, is an act of negation, of resistance to that which is forced upon it. This is what thought has inherited from its archetype, the relation between labor and material. Today, when ideologues tend more than ever to encourage thought to be positive, they cleverly note that positivity runs precisely counter to thought and that it takes friendly persuasion by social authority to accustom thought to positivity. The effort implied in the concept of thought itself, as the counterpart of passive contemplation, is negative already, a revolt against being importuned to bow to every immediate thing. Critical germs are contained in judgment and inference, the thought forms without which not even the critique of thought can do. They are never definite without simultaneously excluding what they have failed to achieve, and whatever does not bear their stamp will be denied, although with questionable authority, by the truth they seek to organize. The judgment that a thing is such and such is a potential rebuttal to claims of any relation of its subject and predicate other than the one expressed in the judgment. Thought forms tend beyond that which merely exists, is merely given. The point which thinking aims at its material is not solely a spiritualized control of nature, while doing violence to the object of its syntheses. Our thinking heeds a potential that waits in the object, and it unconsciously obeys the idea of making amends to the pieces for what it has done. In philosophy, this unconscious tendency becomes conscious. Accompanying irreconcilable thoughts is the hope for reconcilement, because the resistance of thought to mere things in being, the commanding freedom of the subject, intends in the object even that of which the object was deprived by objectification. Attitude toward systems. Traditional speculation has developed the synthesis of diversity, which it conceived as chaotic, on Kantian grounds, and its ultimate aim was to divest itself of any kind of content. By contrast, the telos of philosophy, its open and unshielded part, is as anti-systematic as its freedom to interpret the phenomena with which it joins unarmed issue. Philosophy retains respect for systems to the extent to which things heterogeneous to it face it in the form of a system. The administered world moves in this direction. It is the negative objectivity that is a system, not the positive subject. In a historical phase in which systems, insofar as they deal seriously with contents, have been relegated to the ominous realm of conceptual poetry and nothing but the pale outline of their schematic order has been retained, it is difficult to imagine vividly what used to attract a philosophical spirit to the system. When we contemplate philosophical history, the virtue of partisanship must not keep us from perceiving how superior the system, whether rationalistic or idealistic, has been to its opponents for more than 2 centuries. Compared with the systems, the opposition seems trivial. Systems elaborate things, they interpret the world while the others really keep protesting only that it can't be done. The others display resignation, denial, failure. If they had more truth in the end, it would indicate the transience of philosophy. In any case, it would be up to philosophy to elevate such truth from its subaltern state and to champion it against the philosophies which not only boast of their higher rank, Materialism in particular shows to this day that it was spawned in Abdera. According to Nietzsche's critique, systems no longer documented anything but the finickiness of scholars compensating themselves for political impotence by conceptually construing their, so to speak, administrative authority over things in being. But the systematic need, the need not to put up with the member of the seeker of knowledge but to achieve the absolute knowledge that is already, involuntarily, claimed in each succinct individual judgment. This need was more, at times, than a pseudomorphosis of the spirit into the irresistibly successful method of mathematical and natural science. In the philosophy of history, the systems of the 17th century especially served a compensatory purpose. The ratio which in accordance with bourgeois class interests had smashed the feudal order and scholastic ontology, the form of the intellectual reflection of that order. This same ratio no sooner faced the ruins, its own handiwork, than it would be struck by fear of chaos. It trembled before the menace that continued underneath its own domain, waxing stronger in proportion to its own power. This fear shaped the beginnings of a mode of conduct constitutive for bourgeois existence as a whole, of the neutralization, by confirming the existent order, of every emancipatory step. In the shadow of its own incomplete emancipation, the bourgeois consciousness must fear to be annulled by a more advanced consciousness, not being the whole freedom. It senses that it can produce only a caricature of freedom, hence its theoretical expansion of its autonomy into a system similar to its own coercive mechanisms. Out of itself, the bourgeois ratio undertook to produce the order it had negated outside itself. Once produced, however, that order ceased to be an order and was therefore insatiable. Every system was such an order, such an absurdly rational product, a posited thing posing as being in itself. Its origin had to be placed into formal thought divorced from content. Nothing else would let it control the material. The philosophical systems were antinomical from the outset, their rudiments entwined with their own impossibility. It was precisely in the early history of the modern systems that each was condemned to annihilation at the hands of the next. To prevail as a system, the ratio eliminated virtually all qualitative definitions it referred to, thus coming into an irreconcilable conflict with the objectivity it violated by pretending to grasp it. The ratio came to be removed from objectivity. The farther removed, the more completely objectivity was subjected to its axioms, and finally to the one axiom of identity, the pedantries of all systems, down to the architectonic complexities of Kant, and even of Hegel, despite the latter's program, are the marks of an a priori inescapable failure, noted with incomparable honesty in the fractures of the Kantian system. Molière was the first to show pedantry as a main feature of the ontology of the bourgeois spirit. Whenever something that is to be conceived flees from identity with the concept will be forced to take exaggerated steps to prevent any doubts of the unassailable validity, solidity, and acribia of the thought product from stirring. Great philosophy was accompanied by a paranoid zeal to tolerate nothing else, and to pursue everything else with all the cunning of reason, while the other kept retreating farther and farther from the pursuit. The slightest remnant of non-identity sufficed to deny an identity conceived as total. The excrescences of the systems, ever since the Cartesian pineal gland and the axioms and definitions of Spinoza, already crammed with the entire rationalism he would then deductively extract, by their untruth. These excrescences show the untruth, the mania, of the systems themselves. Idealism as rage, the system in which the sovereign mind imagined itself transfigured, has its primal history in the pre-mental, the animal life of the species. Predators get hungry, but pouncing on their prey is difficult and often dangerous. Additional impulses may be needed for the beast to dare it. These impulses and the unpleasantness of hunger fuse into rage at the victim, a rage whose expression in turn serves the end of frightening and paralyzing the victim. In the advance to humanity, this is rationalized by projection. The rational animal with an appetite for his opponent is already fortunate enough to have a superego and must find a reason. The more completely his actions follow the law of self-preservation, the less can he admit the primacy of that law to himself and to others. If he did, his laboriously attained status of a zoon politican would lose all credibility. The animal to be devoured must be evil. The sublimation of this anthropological schema extends all the way to epistemology. Idealism, most explicitly Fichte, gives unconscious way to the ideology that the not I, L or true, and finally all that reminds us of nature is inferior, so the unity of the self-preserving thought may devour it without misgivings. This justifies the principle of the thought as much as it increases the appetite. The system is the belly-turned mind, and rage is the mark of each and every idealism. It disfigures even Kant's humanism and refutes the aura of higher and nobler things in which he knew how to garb it. The view of man in the middle is akin to misanthropy, leave nothing unchallenged. The august inexorability of the moral law was this kind of rationalized rage at non-identity. Nor did the liberalistic Hegel do better with the superiority of his bad conscience, dressing down those who refused homage to the speculative concept. The hypostasis of the mind, Nietzsche's liberating act, a true turning point of Western thought and merely usurped by others later, was to put such mysteries into words. A mind that discards rationalization, its own spell, ceases by its self-reflection to be the radical evil that irks it in another. Yet the process in which the systems decomposed, due to their own insufficiency, stands in counterpoint to a social process. In the form of the barter principle, the bourgeois ratio really approximated to the systems whatever it would make commensurable with itself, would identify with itself, and it did so with increasing, if potentially homicidal, success. Less and less was left outside. What proved idle in theory was ironically borne out in practice. Hence the ideological popularity of talk about a crisis of the system among all the types who earlier could not spout enough stentorian rancor at the apostle, according to the system's own, already obsolete ideal. Reality is no longer to be construed, because it would be all too thoroughly construable. Pretexts are furnished by its irrationality, intensifying under the thought or conception which has before it only a definite being. Existence is to be relegated to the aforementioned beginning of science that was made by Parmenides, who purified and exalted his conceiving, and thus the conceiving of subsequent times as well, into the pure thought of being as such, and thus created the element of science. Hegel, Works 4, page 96. Pressure of particular rationality. There is disintegration by way of integration. If society could be seen through as a closed system, a system accordingly and reconciled to the subjects, it would become too embarrassing for the subjects as long as they remain subjects in any sense. Angst, that supposed existential, is the claustrophobia of a systematized society. Its system character, yesterday still a shibboleth of academic philosophy, is strenuously denied by initiates of that philosophy. They may, with impunity, pose as spokesman for free, for original, indeed, for unacademic thinking. Criticism of the systems is not vitiated by such abuse. A proposition common to all emphatic philosophy, as opposed to the skeptical one, which refrained from emphasis, was that only as a system could philosophy be pursued. This proposition has done hardly less to cripple philosophy than have the empiricisms. The things philosophy has yet to judge are postulated before it begins. The system, the form of presenting a totality to which nothing remains extraneous, absolutizes the thought thought against each of its contents and evaporates the content in thoughts. It proceeds idealistically before advancing any arguments for idealism. The twofold character of a system. In criticism we do not simply liquidate systems. However, at the peak of the Enlightenment, D'Alembert rightly distinguished between l'esprit de système and l'esprit systématique, and the method of the encyclopédie took account of the distinction. Speaking for the esprit systématique is not only the trivial motive of a cohesion that will tend to crystallize in the incoherent anyway, it does not only satisfy the bureaucrat's desire to stuff all things into their categories. The form of the system is adequate to the world, whose substance eludes the hegemony of the human thought, but unity and unanimity are at the same time an oblique projection of pacified, no longer antagonistic conditions upon the coordinates of supremacist, oppressive thinking. The double meaning of philosophical systematics leaves no choice but to transpose a power of thought, once delivered from the systems, into the open realm of definition by individual moments. To Hegelian logic this procedure was not altogether alien. The microanalysis of individual categories, which simultaneously appears as their objective self-reflection, was to let each concept pass into its otherness without regard to an overlay from above. To Hegel, the totality of this movement meant the system. There is contradiction as well as kinship between this concept of the system, a concept that concludes, and thus brings to a standstill, and the concept of dynamism, of pure, autarkic, subjective generation, which constitutes all philosophical systematics. Hegel could adjust the tension between statics and dynamics only by construing his Unitarian principle, the spirit, as a simultaneous being in itself and pure becoming, a resumption of the Aristotelian scholastic actus purus, and that the implausibility of this construction, in which subjective generation and ontology, nominalism and realism, are syncopated at the Archimedean point, will prevent the resolution of that tension is also imminent in the system. And yet, such a concept of the philosophical system towers above a merely scientific systematics that call for orderly organization and presentation of thoughts, for a consistent structure of topical disciplines, without insisting strictly, from the object's point of view, upon the inner unity of its aspects. The postulate of this unity is bound up with the presupposition that all things in being are identical with the cognitive principle, but on the other hand, once burdened as it is in idealistic speculation, that postulate legitimately recalls the affinity which objects have for each other, and which is tabooed by the scientific need for order and obliged to yield to the surrogate of its schemata. What the objects communicate in, instead of each being the atom it becomes in the logic of classification, is a trace of the object's definition of themselves, which Kant denied in Hegel, against Kant, sought to restore through the subject. To comprehend a thing itself, not just to fit and register it in its system of reference, is nothing but to perceive the individual moment in its immanent connection with others. Such anti-subjectivism lies under the crackling shell of absolute idealism. It stirs in the tendency to unseal current issues by resorting to the way they came to be. What the conception of the system recalls, in reverse, is a coherence of the non-identical, the very thing infringed by deductive systematics. Criticism of systems and a systematic thought are superficial as long as they cannot release the cohesive force which the idealistic systems had signed over to the transcendental subject. The antinomical character of systems, the ego principle that founds the system, the pure method before any content, has always been the ratio. It is not confined by anything outside it, not even by a so-called mental order. Idealism, attesting the positive infinity of its principle at every one of its stages, turns the character of thought, the historic evolution of its independence, into metaphysics. It eliminates all heterogeneous being. This defines the system as pure becoming, a pure process, and eventually as that absolute engendering which Fichte, in this respect the authentic systematizer of philosophy, declared thinking to be. Kant had already held that the emancipated ratio, the progressus ad infinitum, is halted solely by recognizing non-identities in form, at least, the antinomy of totality and infinity. For the restless ad infinitum explodes the self-contained system, for all its being owed to infinity alone, is of the essence of idealism. It imitates a central antinomy of bourgeois society, to preserve itself, to remain the same, to be. That society too must constantly expand, progress, advance its frontiers, not respect any limit, not remain the same. Neither it has been demonstrated to bourgeois society that it would no sooner reach a ceiling, would no sooner cease to have non-capitalist areas available outside itself, than its own concept would force its self-liquidation. This makes clear why, Aristotle notwithstanding, the modern concept of dynamics was inappropriate to antiquity, as was the concept of the system. To Plato, who chose the aporetical form for so many of his dialogues, both concepts could be imputed only in retrospect. The reprimand which Kant gave the old man for that reason is not, as he put it, a matter of plain logic. It is historical, modern through and through. On the other hand, systematics is so deeply ingrained in the modern consciousness that even Husserl's anti-systematic efforts, which began under the name of ontology, and from which fundamental ontology branched off later, reverted irresistibly to a system, at the price of formalization. Thus intertwined, the system's static and dynamic characters keep clashing. No matter how dynamically a system may be conceived, if it is in fact to be a closed system, to tolerate nothing outside its domain, it will become a positive infinity. In other words, finite and static. The fact that it sustains itself in this manner, for which Hegel praised his own system, brings it to a standstill. Bluntly put, closed systems are bound to be finished. Eccentricities like the one constantly held up to Hegel, of world history being perfected in the Prussian state, are not mere aberrations for ideological purposes, nor are they irrelevant vis-a-vis the whole. Their necessary absurdity shatters the asserted unity of system and dynamics, by negating the concept of the limit and theoretically assuring itself that there always remains something outside. Dynamics also tends to disavow its own product, the system, an aspect under which it might well be fruitful to treat the history of modern philosophy as how it managed to cope with the antagonism of statics and dynamics in its systems. The Hegelian system in itself was not a true becoming. Implicitly, each single definition in it was already preconceived. Such safeguards condemned it to untruth. Unconsciously, so to speak, consciousness would have to immerse itself in the phenomena on which it takes a stand. This would, of course, effect a qualitative change in dialectics. Systematic unanimity would crumble. The phenomenon would not remain a case of its concept, as it does to Hegel, despite all pronouncements to the contrary. The thought would be burdened with more toil and trouble than Hegel defines as such, because the thought he discusses always extracts from its objects only that which is a thought already. Despite the program of self-yielding, the Hegelian thought finds satisfaction in itself. It goes rolling along, however often it may urge the contrary. If the thought really yielded to the object, if its attention were on the object, not on its category, the very objects would start talking under the lingering eye. Hegel had argued against epistemology that one becomes a smith only by smithing, by the actual cognition of things that resist cognition, of things which are, so to speak, a theoretical. There we have to take him at his word. nothing else would return to philosophy what Hegel calls the freedom to the object, what philosophy had lost under the spell of the concept freedom, of the subject sense determining autonomy. But the speculative power to break down the gates of the insoluble is the power of negation. The systematic trend lives on in negation alone. The categories of a critique of systems are at the same time the categories in which the particular is understood. What has once legitimately transcended particularity in the system has its place outside the system. The interpretive eye which sees more in a phenomenon than it is, and solely because of what it is, secularizes metaphysics. Only a philosophy in fragment form would give their proper place to the monads. Those illusory idealistic drafts, they would be conceptions, in the particular, of the totality that is inconceivable as such. Argument and experience, the thought, to which a positive hypostasis of anything outside actual dialectics is forbidden, overshoots the object with which it no longer simulates being as one. It grows more independent than in the conception of its absoluteness, in which sovereignty and complaisance mingle, each inwardly depending on the other. This may have been the end to which Kant exempted the intelligible sphere from all immanence, an aspect of emotion in particularity. That extreme enhancement of dialectical immanence must also be the freedom to step out of the object, a freedom which the identity claim cuts short. Hegel would have censured that freedom. He relied upon complete mediation by the objects. In cognitive practice, when we resolve the insoluble, a moment of such cogitative transcendence comes to light in the fact that for our micrological activity we have exclusively macrological means. The call for binding statements without a system is a call for thought models, and these are not merely monadological in kind. A model covers the specific, and more than the specific, without letting it evaporate in its more general superconcept. Philosophical thinking is the same as thinking in models. Negative dialectics is an ensemble of analyses of models. Philosophy would be debasing itself all over again, into a kind of affirmative solace, if it were to fool itself and others about the fact that it must, from without, imbue its objects with whatever moves them within it. What is waiting in the objects themselves needs such intervention to come to speak, with the perspective that the force is mobilized outside, and ultimately every theory that is brought to bear on the phenomena, should come to rest in the phenomena. In that sense, too, philosophical theory means that its own end lies in its realization. There is no lack of related intentions in history. The French Enlightenment got a formally systematic touch from its supreme concept, that of reason. Yet the constitutive entanglement of its idea of reason with that of an objectively rational arrangement of society deprived the idea of a pathos which it was not to recover until the realization of reason as an idea was renounced, until it was absolutized into the spirit. Encyclopedic thinking, rationally organized and yet discontinuous, unsystematic, loose, expressed the self-critical spirit of reason. That spirit represented something which later departed from philosophy, due as much to its increasing distance from practical life as to its absorption in the academic bustle. It represented mundane experience, that eye for reality of which thought, too, is a part. The free spirit is nothing else. The element of the homme de lettres, disparaged by a petty bourgeois scientific ethos, is indispensable to thought, and no less indispensable, of course, is the element abused by a philosophy garb de science, the meditative contraction, the argument, which came to merit so much skepticism. Whenever philosophy was substantial, both elements would coincide, at a distance. Dialectics might be characterized as the elevation to self-consciousness of the effort to be saturated with dialectics. Otherwise the argument deteriorates into the technique of conceptless specialists amid the concept, as it is now spreading academically in the so-called analytical philosophy, which robots can learn and copy. The eminently argumentative element is legitimate where the reality that has been integrated in a system is received in order to oppose it with its own strength. The free part of thought, on the other hand, represents the authority which already knows about the emphatic untruth of that real systematic context. Without this knowledge there would be no eruption. Without adopting the power of the system, the outbreak would fail. That the two elements will not merge without a rift is due to the real power of the system, which includes even what potentially excels it. The untruth of the immanent context itself, however, shows in the overwhelming experience that the world, though organized as systematically as if it were Hegel's glorified realization of reason, will at the same time, in its old unreason, perpetuate the impotence of the seemingly almighty spirit. The immanent critic of idealism defends idealism by showing how much it is defrauded of its own self, how much the first cause, which according to idealism is always the spirit, is in league with the blind predominance of merely existing things. The doctrine of the absolute spirit immediately aids that predominance. A scientific consensus tends to admit that experience also implies theory. It holds, however, that experience is a standpoint, hypothetically at best. Conciliatory representatives of seemtivism demand that what they call decent or clean science should account for premises of the sort. Precisely this demand is incompatible with the mind's experience. Any standpoint it were asked to have would be that of a diner regarding the roast. Experience lives by consuming the standpoint. Not until the standpoint is submerged in it would there be philosophy. Until then, theory and mental experience embodies that discipline which already pained Goethe in relation to Kant. If experience were to trust solely to its dynamics and good fortune, there would be no stopping. Ideology lies in wait for the mind which delights in itself like Nietzsche's Zarathustra, for the mind which all but irresistibly becomes an absolute to itself. Theory prevents this. It corrects the naive self-confidence of the mind without obliging it to sacrifice its spontaneity, at which theory aims in its turn. For the difference between the so-called subjective part of mental experience and its objects will not vanish by any means, as witness the necessary and painful exertions of the knowing subject. In the unreconciled condition, non-identity is experienced as negativity. From the negative, the subject withdraws to itself, and to the abundance of its ways to react. Critical self-reflection alone will keep it from a constriction of this abundance, from building walls between itself and the object, from the supposition that its being for itself is in and for itself. The less identity can be assumed between subject and object, the more contradictory are the demands made upon the cognitive subject, upon its unfettered strength and candid self-reflection. Theory and mental experience need to interact. Theory does not contain answers to everything. It reacts to the world, which is faulty to the core. What would be free from the spell of the world is not under theory's jurisdiction. Mobility is of the essence of consciousness. It is no accidental feature. It means a doubled mode of conduct, an inner one, the immanent process which is the properly dialectical one, and a free, unbound one like a stepping out of dialectics. Yet the two are not merely disparate. The unregimented thought has an elective affinity to dialectics, which as criticism of the system recalls what would be outside the system, and the force that liberates the dialectical movement in cognition is the very same that rebels against the system. Both attitudes of consciousness are linked by criticizing one another, not by compromising. Vertiginousness. A dialectics no longer glue to identity will provoke either the charge that it is bottomless, one that ye shall know by its fascist fruits, or the objection that it is dizzying. In great modern poetry, vertigo has been a central feeling since Baudelaire. The anachronistic suggestion often made to philosophy is that it must have no part in in any such thing. Philosophy is cautioned to speak to the point. Karl Kraus had to learn that no matter how precisely each line of his expressed his meaning, a materialized consciousness would lament that this very precision was making its head swim. A usage of current opinion makes such complaints comprehensible. We like to present alternatives to choose from, to be marked true or false. The decisions of a bureaucracy are frequently reduced to yes or no answers to drafts submitted to it. The bureaucratic way of thinking has become the secret model for a thought allegedly still free. But the responsibility of philosophical thought in its essential situations is not to play this game. A given alternative is already a piece of heteronomy. The legitimacy of alternative demands is yet to be judged by the very consciousness that is moralistically asked to make its decision beforehand. To insist on the profession of a standpoint is to extend the coercion of conscience to the realm of theory. With this coercion goes a coarsening process in which not even the great theorems retain their truth content after the adjuncts have been eliminated. Marx and Engels, for instance, objected to having their dynamic class theory and its knife-edged economic expression diluted by substituting the simpler antithesis of rich and poor. The essence is falsified by a resume of essentials. If philosophy were to stoop to a practice which Hegel already mocked, if it were to accommodate its kind of reader by explaining what the thought should make him think, it would be joining the march of regression without being able to keep up the pace. Behind the worry where to take hold of philosophy lies mostly pure aggression, a desire to take hold of it the way the historical schools used to devour each other. The equivalence of guilt and penance has been transposed to the sequence of thoughts. It is this very assimilation of the spirit to the reigning principle through which we see in philosophical reflection. Traditional thinking, and the common sense habits it left behind after fading out philosophically, demand a frame of reference in which all things have their place. Not too much importance is attached to the intelligibility of the frame. It may even be laid down in dogmatic axioms, if only each reflection can be localized, and if unframed thoughts are kept out. But a cognition that is to bear fruit will throw itself to the objects a fond perdu. The vertigo which this causes is an index very. The shock of inconclusiveness, the negative as which it cannot help appearing in the frame covered, never kanging realm, is truth or untruth only. Fragility of truth, the dismantling of systems, and of the system at large, is not an act of formal epistemology. What the system used to procure for the details can be sought in the details only, without advance assurance to the thought, whether it is there, or what it is. Not until then would the steadily misused word of truth as concreteness come into its own. It compels our thinking to abide with minutiae. We are not to philosophize about concrete things, we are to philosophize, rather, out of these things. But if we surrender to the specific object we are suspected of lacking an unequivocal position. What differs from the existent will strike the existent as witchcraft, while thought figures such as proximity, home, security hold the faulty world under their spell. Men are afraid that in losing this magic they would lose everything, because the only happiness they know, even in thought, is to be able to hold on to something, the perpetuation of unfreedom. They want a bit of ontology, at least, amidst their criticism of ontology, as if the smallest free insight did not express the goal better than a declaration of intention that is not followed up. Philosophy serves to bear out an experience which Schoenberg noted in traditional musicology. One really learns from it only how a movement begins and ends, nothing about the movement itself and its course. Analogously, instead of reducing philosophy to categories, one would in a sense have to compose it first. Its course must be a ceaseless self-renewal, by its own strength as well as in friction with whatever standard it may have. The crux is what happens in it, not a thesis or a position, the texture, not the deductive or inductive course of one-track minds. Essentially, therefore, philosophy is not expandable. If it were, it would be superfluous. The fact that most of it can be expounded speaks against it. But if a mode of conduct shields no primacy, harbors no certainty, and yet, because of its definite presentation, if on no other grounds, concedes so little to relativism, the twin of absolutism, that it approaches a doctrine, such a mode will give offense. It goes beyond, and to the point of breaking with, the dialectics of Hegel, who wanted his dialectics to be all things, including prima philosophia, and in fact made it that in his principle of identity, his absolute subject, by dissociating thought from primacy and solidity. However, we do not absolutize it as in free suspense. The very dissociation fastens it to that which it is not. It removes the illusion of the autarky of thought, the falsehood of an unleashed rationality running away from itself. The recoil of enlightenment into mythology is rationally definable. To think means to think something. By itself, the logically abstract form of something that is meant or judged, does not claim to posit a being, and yet, surviving in it, indelible for a thinking that would delete it, is that which is not identical with thinking, which is not thinking at all. The ratio becomes irrational where it forgets this, where it runs counter to the meaning of thought by hypostasizing its products, the abstractions. The commandment of its autarky condemns thinking to emptiness, and finally to stupidity and primitivity. The charge of bottomlessness should be lodged against the self-preserving mental principle as the sphere of absolute origins. Beware ontology, Heidegger in the lead, hits upon bottomlessness. There is the place of truth. Truth is suspended and frail, due to its temporal substance. Benjamin sharply criticized Gottfried Keller's arch-bourgeois dictum that the truth can't run away from us. Philosophy must do without the consolation that truth cannot be lost, a truth that cannot plunge into the abyss which the metaphysical fundamentalists prate about. It is not the abyss of agile sophistry, but that of madness. Will at the bidding of its certainty principle turn analytical, a potential tautology. Only thoughts that go the limit are facing up to the omnipotent impotence of certain accord. Only a cerebral acrobatics keeps relating to the matter, for which, according to the fable convenu, it has nothing but disdain for the sake of itself. Satisfaction. No unreflected banality can remain true as an imprint of the wrong life. Any attempt to bring thought, particularly for its utility's sake, to a halt with the hackneyed description of it as smugly exaggerated and non-committal is reactionary nowadays. The argument might be reduced to a vulgar form. If you want me to, I'll make innumerable analyses like that, rendering each one worthless. Peter Altenberg gave the appropriate reply to a man who cast the same sort of aspersion on his abbreviated literary forms. But I don't want you to. The open thought has no protection against the risk of decline into randomness. Nothing assures it of a saturation with the matter that will suffice to surmount that risk, but the consistency of its performance, the density of its texture, helps the thought to hit the mark. There has been an about-face in the function of the concept of certainty in philosophy. What was once to surpass dogmas and the tutelage of self-certainty has become the social insurance of a cognition that is to be proof against any untoward happening. And indeed, to the unobjectionable nothing happens. Against relativism. In the history of philosophy we repeatedly find epistemological categories turned into moral ones. The most striking instance, although by no means the only one, is Fichte's interpretation of Kant. Something similar happened with logical phenomenological absolutism. To fundamental ontologists, relativism is the offense of bottomless thinking. Dialectics is a strict directly opposed to that as to absolutism, but it does not seek a middle ground between the two. It opposes them through the extremes themselves, convicts them of untruth by their own ideas. Against relativism, this procedure is overdue because most of its criticism has been so formal in nature as to leave the fiber of relativistic thinking more or less untouched. The popular argument against Spengler, for example, that relativism presupposes at least one absolute, its own validity, and thus contradicts itself, is shabby. It confuses the general denial of a principle with the denial's own elevation to affirmative rank, regardless of the specific difference in the positional value of both. More fruitful might be the recognition of relativism as a limited form of consciousness. It began as that of bourgeois individualism, in which the individual consciousness is taken for the ultimate and all individual opinions are accorded equal rights, as if there were no criterion of their truth. Proponents of the abstract thesis that every man's thought is conditioned should be most concretely reminded that so is their own, that it is blind to the supra-individual element which alone turns individual consciousness into thought. The attitude behind that thesis is one of disdaining the mind and respecting the predominance of material conditions, considered the only thing that counts. A father's retort to his son's decidedly uncomfortable views is that all things are relative, that money makes the man. As in the Greek proverb, relativism is a popularized materialism. Thought gets in the way of money-making. Such a flatly anti-intellectual posture must necessarily remain abstract. The relativity of all cognition can always be asserted only from without, for as long as there is no act of concrete cognition, consciousness no sooner enters into some definite thing, no sooner faces its immanent claim to be true or false, than the thought's allegedly subjective accidentality will dissolve. Relativism is nugatory for another reason. The things it considers random and accidental, on the one hand, and irreducible on the other, those things themselves are brought forth by an objectivity, by an objective individualist society, and can be deduced from it as socially necessary phenomena. The reactive modes which relativistic doctrine holds to be peculiar to each individual are pre-established. They are never far from the bleating of sheep, the stereotype of relativity in particular, and indeed, Kanye relativists such as Pareto have extended the individualistic phenomenality to group interests. But the bounds of objectivity which sociology has drawn, the bounds which are specific to its strata, are on their part only so much more deducible from the whole of society, from the objective realm. In Mannheim's late version of sociological relativism, which fancies that scientific objectivity might be distilled from the different perspectives of the strata of a freely suspended intelligence, the factors are reversed. The conditioning becomes the conditioned. In fact, the law that governs the divergent perspectives is the structure of the social process as a preordained whole. Knowledge of the whole makes the perspectives binding. An entrepreneur who wants to stay competitive must calculate so that the uncompensated portion of the yield of other people's labor will go to him as profit, and he must believe that what he is doing is a fair exchange of labor against the cost of its reproduction. It can be just as stringently shown, however, why this objectively necessary belief is an objective falsehood. The dialectical relation voids its particular elements in itself. The alleged social relativity of views obeys the objective law of social production under private ownership of the means of production. Bourgeois skepticism, of which relativism is the doctrinal embodiment, is obtuse, but the perennial anti-intellectualism is more than an anthropological trait of bourgeois subjectivity. It is due to the fact that under the existing conditions of production the concept of reason, once emancipated, must fear that its consistent pursuit will explode those conditions. This is why reason limits itself. Throughout the bourgeois era, the spirit's accompanying reaction to the idea of its autonomy has been to despise itself. The spirit cannot forgive itself for being barred, by the constitution of the existence it guides, from unfolding the freedom inherent in its concept. The philosophical term for this prohibition is relativism. No dogmatic absolutism need be summoned against it. It is crushed by being proved narrow. Relativism, no matter how progressive its bearing, has at all times been linked with moments of reaction, beginning with the sophist's availability to the more powerful interests. To intervene by criticizing relativism is the paradigm of definite negation. Dialectics and solidity. Unleashed dialectics is not without anything solid, no more than is Hegel, but it no longer confers primacy on it. Hegel did not overstress the solid features in the origin of his metaphysics. They were to emerge from it at the end, as a translucent entirety. This lends a peculiar duplicity to his logical categories. They are structures that have originated, structures that void themselves, and at the same time they are a priori, invariant structures. With dynamism they are made to accord by the doctrine of an immediacy newly restored in each dialectical stage. The theory of second nature, to which Hegel already gave a critical tinge, is not lost to a negative dialectics. It assumes, tel quel, the abrupt immediacy, the formations which society and its evolution present in our thought, and it does this so that analysis may bear its mediations to the extent of the immanent difference between phenomena and that which they claim to be in themselves. The self-preserving solidity, the young Hegel's positive, is to such analysis, as it was to him the negative. In the preface to Phenomenology he still characterized thought, the archenemy of that positivity, as the negative principle. The road to this is the simplest of reflections. What does not think, what surrenders to visibility, is inclined toward the badly posited by that passive nature which in the critique of reason marks the sensory source of the rights of knowledge. To receive something as it is offered at a time, dispensing with reflection, is potentially always tantamount to recognizing it the way it is. Virtually all thoughts, on the other hand, cause a negative motion. Of course, all his statements to the contrary notwithstanding, Hegel left the subject's primacy over the object unchallenged. It is disguised merely by the semi-theological word spirit with its indelible memories of individual subjectivity. The bill for this is presented in the excessive formality of Hegel's logic. According the activity of distinguishing is the to its own concept it would have to be substantial, but the endeavor to make it all things at once, metaphysics as well as a doctrine of categories, resulted in the elimination of the definite being that might have legitimized its rudiment. In this respect Hegel is not so far removed from Kant and Fichte, whom he never tires of denouncing as spokesmen for abstract subjectivity. For its part, the science of logic is abstract in the simplest sense of the word. The reduction to general concepts is an advanced elimination of the counteragents to those concepts, of that concrete element which idealistic dialectics boasts of harboring and unfolding. The spirit wins its fight against a non-existent foe. Hegel's derogatory remark about contingent existence, the Krugianism which philosophy may, and must, scorn to deduce from itself, is a cry required stop thief having always dealt with the medium of the concept, and reflecting only generally on the relation between the concept and its conceptual content. Hegelian logic has advanced assurance of what it offers to prove, that the concept is absolute. The more critically we see through the autonomy of subjectivity, however, and the clearer our awareness of its own mediated nature, the more incumbent is it upon our thinking to take on what lends it the solidity it does not have in itself. Otherwise we would not even have the dynamics with which dialectics moves its solid burden. Not every experience that appears as primary can be denied point blank. If conscious experience were utterly lacking in what Kierkegaard defended as naivete, thought would be unsure of itself, would do what the establishment expects of it, and would become still more naive. Even terms such as original experience, terms compromised by phenomenology and neo-ontology, denote a truth while pompously doing it harm. Unless resistance to the facade stirs spontaneously, heedless of its own dependencies, thought and activity are dull copies. Whichever part of the object exceeds the definitions imposed on it by thinking will face the subject, first of all, as immediacy, and again, where the subject feels altogether sure of itself. In primary experience, it will be least subjective, the most subjective, the immediate datum, eludes the subject's intervention. Yet such immediate consciousness is neither continuously maintainable nor downright positive, for consciousness is at the same time the universal medium and cannot jump across its shadow even in its own données immediates. They are not the truth. The confidence that from immediacy, from the solid and downright primary, an unbroken entirety will spring. This confidence is an idealistic chimera. To dialectics, immediacy does not maintain its immediate pose. Instead of becoming the ground, it becomes a moment. At the opposite pole, the same thing happens to the invariants of pure thought. Nothing but a childish relativism would deny the validity of formal logic and mathematics and treat them as ephemeral because they have come to be. Yet the invariants, whose own invariance has been produced, cannot be peeled out of the variables as if all truth were at hand. Then, truth has coalesced with substance, which will change. Immutability of truth is the delusion of prima philosophia. The invariants are not identically resolved in the dynamics of history and of consciousness, but they are moments in that dynamics, stabilized as transcendence. They become ideology. By no means will ideology always resemble the explicit idealistic philosophy. Ideology lies in the substruction of something primary, the content of which hardly matters. It lies in the implicit identity of concept and thing, an identity justified by the world even when a doctrine summarily teaches that consciousness depends on being, the privilege of experience, in sharp contrast to the usual ideal of science. The objectivity of dialectical cognition needs not less subjectivity, but more. Philosophical experience withers otherwise, but our positivistic zeitgeist is allergic to this need. It holds that not all men are capable of such experience, that it is the prerogative of individuals destined for it by their disposition and life story, that calling for it as a premise of cognition is elitist and undemocratic. Granted, philosophical experiences are indeed not equally accessible to everyone, not the way all men of comparable IQ should be able to repeat experiments in the natural sciences, for instance, or to grasp the cogency of mathematical deductions, although current opinion regards these faculties as requiring even more of a specific talent. In any case, compared with the virtually subjectless rationality of a scientific ideal that regards all men as interchangeable, the subjective share in philosophy retains an irrational adjunct. It is not a quality of nature. While the argument pretends to be democratic, it ignores what the administered world makes of its compulsory members. Only a mind which it has not entirely molded can withstand it. Criticizing privilege becomes a privilege. The world's course is as dialectical as that. Under social conditions, educational ones, in particular, which prune and often cripple the forces of mental productivity, and considering the prevailing dearth of images and the pathogenic processes in early childhood which psychoanalysis diagnoses but cannot really change, it would be fictitious to assume that all men might understand, or even perceive, all things. To expect this would be to make cognition accord with the pathic features of a mankind stripped of its capacity for experience. If it ever had this capacity, and by a law of perpetual sameness, the construction of truth in analogy to a volonté datus, which is the final consequence of the concept of subjective reason, would in all men's name defraud all men of what they need. If a stroke of undeserved luck has kept the mental composition of some individuals not quite adjusted to the prevailing norms, a stroke of luck they have often enough to pay for in their relations with their environment, it is up to these individuals to make the moral and, as it were, representative effort to say what most of those for whom they say it cannot see or, to do justice to reality, will not allow themselves to see. Direct communicability to everyone is not a criterion of truth. We must resist the all but universal compulsion to confuse the communication of knowledge with knowledge itself, and to rate it higher, if possible, whereas at present each communicative step is falsifying truth and selling it out. Meanwhile, whatever has to do with language suffers of this paradoxicality. Truth is objective, not plausible. It falls into no man's lap. It does take objective conveyance, but just as applicable to its web is what Spinoza over-enthusiastically claimed for each single truth, that it is its own index. As for the privileged character which Ranker holds against it, truth will lose that character when men stop pleading the experiences they owe it, when they let it enter instead into configurations and causal contexts that help to make it evident or to convict it of its failings. Elitist pride would be the last thing to befit the philosophical experience. He who has it must admit to himself how much, according to his possibilities in existence, his experience has been contaminated by existence, and ultimately by the class relationship. In philosophical experience, chances which the universal desultorily affords to individuals turn against the universal that sabotages the universality of such experience. If this universality were established, the experience of all individuals would change accordingly, losing much of the accidental character which until then incurably disfigures it even where it keeps stirring. Hegel's doctrine of the self-reflecting object survives its idealistic version because in a changed dialectics the subject's divestment of sovereignty turns it even more into a reflexive form of its object. The less definitive and all-encompassing a theory is claimed to be, the less of an object will it become to the thinker. As the compulsion of the system evaporates, he will be free to rely more frankly on his own consciousness and experience than was permitted by the pathos-filled conception of a subjectivity whose abstract triumph would exact the price of renouncing its specific substance. This price was in line with the emancipation of individuality that occurred between the great age of idealism and the present, and whose achievements, despite, and because of, the present pressure of collective regression, are theoretically as irrevocable as the impulses of the dialectics of 1800. 19th century individualism has indeed weakened the objectifying power of the mind, its capacity for insight into objectivity and for its construction, but it has also equipped the mind with a discriminating sense that strengthened its experience of the object, the qualitative moment of rationality. To yield to the object means to do justice to the object's qualitative moments. Scientific objectification, in line with the quantifying tendency of all science since Descartes, tends to eliminate qualities and to transform them into measures measurable definitions. Increasingly, rationality itself is equated more mathematico with the faculty of quantification, while perfectly corresponding to the primacy of a triumphant natural science. This faculty is by no means inherent in the concept of the ratio itself, which is blinded mainly when it balks at the idea that qualitative moments on their part are susceptible of rational conception. Ratio is not merely an ascent from the scattered phenomena to the concept of their species. 11. It calls just as much for an ability to discriminate. Without this, the synthetic function of thought, abstract unification, would not be possible. To aggregate what is alike means necessarily to segregate it from what is different. But what is different is the qualitative. A thinking in which we do not think qualitatively is already emasculated and at odds with itself. At the very dawn of the European philosophy of reason, the qualitative moment of the ratio was still vigorously expressed by Plato, the first to install mathematics as a model of method. Next to, with equal rights, he put, which amounts to the commandment that consciousness, mindful of the Socratic and sophistical separation of and, should adhere to the nature of things and not deal with them arbitrarily. And qualitative distinction is not only incorporated in Plato's Dialectics, in his doctrine of thought, but interpreted as a corrective for the violence of unleashed quantification. A parable from Phaedrus leaves no doubt of it. There, organizing thought and non-violence strike a balance. The principle, reversing the conceptual motion of synthesis, is that of division into species according to the natural formation, where the joints are, not breaking any part as a bad carver might. 12. The qualitative moment is preserved in all quantification, as the substrate of that which is to be quantified. This is what Plato cautions us not to destroy, lest the ratio, impairing the object it should attain, recoil into unreason. In a second reflection, an antidote, as it were, rational operations are accompanied by the same quality that was dismissed in the first, narrowly scientific reflection of a philosophy as alien to science as it is beholden to it. There is no quantified insight whose point, whose terminus ad quem, can be reached without qualitative retranslation. Even in statistics the cognitive goal is qualitative. Quantification is nothing but the means. Absolutizing the ratio's tendency to quantify agrees with its lack of self-reflection, which serves an insistence on the qualitative. It does not raise the specter of irrationality. Later, Hegel alone seemed aware of this without any romantic retrospective leanings. At a time, of course, when quantification did not yet enjoy its present undisputed supremacy, he did agree with the scientific tradition that the truth of quality itself is quantity. 13. But in system of philosophy he recognizes quantity as a definition indifferent to being and extraneous to it. 14. And according to logic, quantity is itself a quality. It retains its relevance in quantitative form, and the quantum returns to quality. 15. Quality and individual, corresponding to the quantifying tendency on the subjective side, was the reduction of the knower to a purely logical universal without qualities. True, the qualities would be free only at an objective stage no longer limited to quantification, no longer having quantification drilled into the man who must make a mental adjustment. But quantification is not a timeless being it is made to seem by mathematics, its instrument. When it claimed exclusiveness it became transient. What awaits the qualitative subject in the matter is the potential of its qualities, not the transcendental residue of this potential, although the subject's restriction by the division of labor strengthens it for that residue alone. Yet as more of the subject's reactions are tabooed as allegedly merely subjective, more qualitative definitions of the object will escape cognition. The ideal of discrimination, of the nuance, an ideal which in cognition, including the latest developments, has never been quite forgotten, despite all science's measurement, refers not only to an individual faculty which objectivity can do without. A discriminating man is one who in the matter and its concept can distinguish even the infinitesimal, that which escapes the concept. Discrimination alone gets down to the infinitesimal, its postulate of a capacity to experience the object, and discrimination is the experience of the object turned into a form of subjective reaction, provides a haven for the mimetic element of knowledge, for the element of elective affinity between the knower and the known. In the total process of enlightenment this element gradually crumbles, but it cannot vanish completely if the process is not to annul itself. Even in the conception of rational knowledge, devoid of all affinity, there survives a groping for that concordance which the magical delusion used to place beyond doubt. If this moment were extinguished altogether, it would be flatly incomprehensible that a subject can know an object. The unleashed rationality would be irrational, in being secularized. However, the mimetic element in turn blends with the rational one. The word for this process is discrimination. It contains the faculty of mimetic reaction as well as the logical organ for the relation of genus, species, and differentia specifica. In the process, the differentiating faculty keeps as accidental a character as does any undiminished individuality compared with the universal of its reason. Yet this element of chance is not radical enough for the criteria of scientificism. Hegel was oddly inconsistent when he arraigned the individual consciousness, the stage of the mental experience that animates his work, as accidental and narrow. The only explanation is an urge to incapacitate the critical element that entwines with the individual mind. Particularizing this, he came to feel the contradictions between the concept and the particular. The individual consciousness is almost always the unhappy one, and with good reason. In his aversion to it, Hegel refuses to face the very fact he underscores where it suits him. How much universality is inherent in that individuality? According to his strategic requirements he treats the individual as if it were the immediacy whose semblance he is destroying. With that, however, the semblance of an absolute contingency of individual experience will disappear as well. Without concepts, that experience would lack continuity. By definition, the part it takes in the discursive medium makes it always more than purely individual. The individual becomes a subject insofar as its individual consciousness objectifies it, in the unity of the self as well as in the unity of its experiences. To animals, presumably, both unities are denied, because it is general in itself, and to the extent to which it is general, individual experience goes as far as the universal. Even in epistemological reflection, logical universality and the unity of the individual consciousness are mutually interdependent. Yet this does not only refer to the subjective formal side of individuality. Every content of individual consciousness is brought to it by its carrier for the sake of his self-preservation, and is reproduced along with that self-preservation. Self-reflection may free the individual consciousness from that dependence and expand it. Spurring that expansion is the agonizing fact that logical universality tends to predominate in individual experience. As the test of reality, experience does not simply double the individual's wishes and whims. It also denies them for the sake of his survival. The subject has no way at all to grasp universals other than in the motion of individual human consciousness. The result of cropping the individual would not be a higher subject cleansed of the dross of accidentality. The only subject to emerge from such an operation would be an unconsciously imitative one. In the East, the theoretical short circuit in the views of individuality has served as a pretext for collective oppression. The party, even if deluded or terrorized, is deemed a priori superior in judgments to each individual because of the number of its members. Yet the isolated individual unhampered by any ukase may at times perceive objectivities more clearly than the collective, which is no more than the ideology of its functionaries. eyes, anyway. Brecht's line, that the party has 1,000 eyes while the individual has but 2, is as false as any bromide ever. A dissenter's exact imagination can see more than 1,000 eyes peering through the same pink spectacles, confusing what they see with universal truth, and regressing. Against this stands the individuation of knowledge. Not only the way the object is perceived depends upon that individuation and differentiation. The differentiation itself is determined by the object, which demands therein its restitutio in integrum, so to speak. Just the same, the modes of subjective reaction which the object needs require ceaseless objective correction in their turn. This occurs in self-reflection, in the ferment of mental experience. Metaphorically speaking, the process of philosophical objectivation would be vertical and intratemporal as opposed to the horizontal, abstractly quantifying one of science. This much of Bergson's metaphysics of time is true. Substantiality and method. Bergson's generation, also Simmel, Husserl, and Schiller, yearned in vain for a philosophy receptive to the objects, a philosophy that would substantialize itself. What tradition tells, tradition wanted. Yet this does not relieve us of methodical reflection on the relative positions of substantial individual analysis and dialectical theory. The idealistic identitarian avowals that the first absorbs the second are unconvincing, built objectively, not just through the knowing subject. The whole which theory expresses is contained in the individual object to be analyzed. What links the two is a matter of substance, the social totality, but the link is also a matter of form, of the abstract legality of the totality itself, the legality of barter. It was from this that idealism distilled its absolute spirit, simultaneously encoding the truth that the linkage happens to phenomena as a coercive mechanism. This lies behind the so-called constitutive problem. In a philosophical experience we do not have this universal immediately, as a phenomenon. We have it as abstractly as it is objective. We are constrained to take our departure from the particular, without forgetting what we know but do not have. The path of philosophical experience is twofold, like that of Heraclitus, one leading upward, one downward, assured of the real determination of phenomena by their concept. Our experience cannot propound this concept ontologically, as truth in itself. The concept is fused with untruth, with the oppressive principle, thus lessening even the dignity of its epistemological criticism. It does not constitute a positive telos that would quench cognition. The negativity of the universal in turn welds cognition to the particular as that which is to be saved. Only thoughts which cannot understand themselves are true. All philosophy, even that which intends freedom, carries in its inalienably general elements the unfreedom in which society prolongs its existence. Coercion is inherent in philosophy, yet coercion alone protects it from regressing into license. The coercive character that is immanent in our thinking can be critically known. The coercion of thought is the medium of its deliverance. Hegel's freedom to the object, the net result of which was the subject's incapacitation, has yet to be achieved. Until then, the divergence between dialectics as a method and substantial dialectics will go on. The principle of dominion, which antagonistically rends human society, is the same principle which, spiritualized, causes the difference between the concept and its subject matter, and that difference assumes the logical form of contradiction because, measured by the principle of dominion, whatever does not bow to its unity will not appear as something different from and indifferent to the principle, but as a violation of logic. The remnant of divergence between philosophical conception and execution, on the other hand, also denotes some of the non-identity that allows the method neither quite to absorb the contents, though it is supposed to be in the contents alone, nor to immaterialize them. The precedence of the matter shows as a necessary insufficiency of the method. What must be said methodically, in the form of general reflection, in order not to be defenseless against the philosopher's philosophy, can be legitimized solely in execution, thus denying the method in turn. A surplus of method, compared with the substance, is abstract and false. Even Hegel had to put up with the discrepancy between his preface to phenomenology and phenomenology itself. The philosophical ideal would be to obviate accounting for the deed by doing it. Existentialism, the most recent attempt to break out of conceptual fetishism, out of academic philosophy, without relinquishing the demand for commitment, went by the name of existentialism. Like fundamental ontology, from which it split off by entering into political commitments, existentialism remained in idealistic bonds. Besides, compared with the philosophical structure, it retained an accidental touch replaceable by politics to the contrary, provided only the politics satisfied the existentialist characteristic of formalists. Each bloc has its partisans. There is no theoretical dividing line from decisionism, and yet the idealistic component of existentialism is a political function. As social critics, Sartre and his friends were unwilling to limit themselves to theoretical criticisms, and it did not escape them that wherever communism had seized power it was digging in as a bureaucracy. The institution of a centralized state party makes a mockery of all past thinking about men's relation to the state. Hence Sartre's total stress upon the moment which the reigning practice will no longer tolerate, on spontaneity. Philosophically speaking, he would urge Kierkegaard's category of decision the more exclusively, the smaller the objective chances left to it by the distribution of social power. Kierkegaard drew the meaning of the category from Christology, its terminus ad quem. Sartre made it the absolute it was to serve. Despite his extreme nominalism, Sartre's philosophy and its most vital rules of the game is played under an unreflected enlightenment. Hegel's restitution of conceptual realism, down to his provocative defense of the ontological argument for the existence of God, was reactionary. Meanwhile, the course of history has justified his anti-nominalist intention. In contrast to the crude schema of Schiller's sociology of knowledge, nominalism on its part has turned into ideology, into the ideology of an eye blinking there isn't any such thing, which official science likes to use as soon as mention is made of such embarrassing entities as class or ideology or, nowadays, society at large. A genuinely critical philosophy's relation to nominalism is not invariant. It changes historically with the function of skepticism. To ascribe any fundamentum in re of concepts to the subject as idealism effective phase was organized according to the old idealistic category of the free act of the subject. To existentialism as to Fichte, any objectivity is a matter of indifference. Consequently, social conditions came in Sartre's place to be topical adjuncts, at best. Structurally, they do hardly more than provide an occasion for the action. The irrationality to which Sartre's philosophical non-objectiveness condemned his plots was surely the last thing in the obdurate Enlightenment apostle's mind. The notion of absolute freedom of choice is as illusionary as that of the absolute I as the world source has ever been. As for the situations that were built up as foils for heroic decisions, a modicum of political experience would make them wobble like stature props. Not even dramaturgically could such a sovereign choice be postulated at a concrete historic juncture. A general who resolved, as irrationally as he used to revel in atrocities, to allow no no more of them to be committed. A general who raised the siege of a city already given into his hands by traitors and set up a utopian community instead. Such a general would have been promptly killed by mutinous soldiers or else recalled by his superiors even in the furious, farcically romanticized times of the German Renaissance. Fitting in only too well with this is the fact that Goethe, bragging like Nestroy's Holofernes who had at least been enlightened about his free act by the massacre of the City of Light, puts himself at the disposal of an organized people's movement, a transparent likeness of the ones against which Sartre plays off his absolute spontaneity. And indeed, although now clearly with philosophy's blessing, the Renaissance man promptly recommits the atrocities he had so freely forsworn. The absolute subject cannot get out of its entanglements. The bonds it would have to tear, the bonds of dominion, are as one with the principle of absolute subjectivity. It honors Sartre that this shows up in his plays, against his philosophical chef d'oeuvre. The plays disavow the philosophy with whose theses they deal. There is, however, a philosophical reason for the follies of political existentialism, as there is for the phraseology of the non-political German one. Existentialism raises nominalism parted company, the inevitable, the sheer existence of men, to the status of a mentality which the individual is to choose, without his choice being determined by any reason, and without there really being another choice. Whenever they go beyond such a tautology, existentialist teachings join hands with subjectivity as a being for itself, and as the sole substantial being. The schools that take derivatives of the Latin existere for their device would cite the realities of tangible experience against the alienated special sciences. For fear of materialization they withdraw from substance. Unwittingly they turn it into an example. What they subsume under will avenge itself by enforcing its power behind the back of philosophy, in decisions which philosophy deems irrational. A thinking purged of substantialities is not superior to a special science stripped of concepts. All versions of such thinking will relapse into the very formalism they combat for the sake of philosophy's vital concern. Afterwards it will be replenished with accidental loans, from psychology in particular. The intent of existentialism, at least in its radical French form, would not be realizable at a distance from the substantial contents, but in menacing proximity to those contents. The dichotomy of subject and object is not to be voided by a reduction to the human person, not even to the absolutely isolated person. The question of man, a question whose present popularity extends all the way to Marxism of the Lukács persuasion, is ideological because its pure form dictates the invariant of the possible answer, even if that invariant is historicity itself. What man ought to be as such is never more than what he has been. He is chained to the rock of his past. He is not only what he was and is, however, but equally what he can come to be, and to anticipate that, no definition suffices. The schools grouped around existence, even the utterly nominalistic ones, are incapable of the self-relinquishment they long for in their recourse to the individual human existence, and they confess that incapacity by philosophizing in general concepts about things not absorbed in their concepts, things running counter to their concepts, instead of thinking them through. They illustrate existence, the concept, by existence, the condition, thing, language, history, how one should think instead has its distant and vague archetype in the various languages, and the names which do not categorically cover the thing, albeit at the cost of their cognitive function. In undiminished cognition we want what we have been drilled to resign ourselves to. What the names that come too close will blind us to. Resignation and delusion are ideological complements. An idiosyncratic precision in the choice of words, as if they were to designate the things, is one of the major reasons why presentation is essential to philosophy. The cognitive reason for much expressive insistence on the is its own dialectics, its conceptual mediation within itself. This is the point of attack for conceiving its non-conceptual side. For mediation in the midst of non-conceptuality is not a remainder after accomplished subtraction, nor something pointing to a bad infinity of such procedures. Rather, the mediation of the is its implicit history. It is from a negative that philosophy draws whatever legitimacy it still retains, from the fact that, in being so and not otherwise, those insolubles which forced philosophy to capitulate and from which idealism declines are another fetish, the fetish of the irrevocability of things in being. What dissolves the fetish is the insight that things are not simply so and not otherwise, that they have come to be under certain conditions. Their becoming fades and dwells within the things. It can no more be stabilized in their concepts than it can be split off from its own results and forgotten. Similar to this becoming is temporal experience. It is when things in being are read as a text of their becoming that idealistic and materialistic dialects touch. But while idealism sees in the inner history of immediacy its vindication as a stage of the concept, materialism makes that inner history the measure, not just of the untruth of concepts, but even more of the immediacy in being. The means employed in negative dialectics for the penetration of its hardened objects is possibility, the possibility of which their reality has cheated the objects and which is nonetheless visible in each one. But no matter how hard we try for linguistic expression of such a history congealed in things, the words we use will remain concepts. Their precision substitutes for the thing itself, without quite bringing its selfhood to mind. There is a gap between words and the thing they conjure. Hence, the residue of arbitrariness and relativity in the choice of words as well as in the presentation as a whole. Benjamin's concepts still tend to an authoritarian concealment of their conceptuality. Concepts alone can achieve what the concept prevents. Cognition is the determinable flaw in every concept makes it necessary to cite others. This is the font of the only constellations which inherited some of the hope of the name. The language of philosophy approaches that name by denying it. The claim of immediate truth for which it chides the words is almost always the ideology of a positive, existent identity of word and thing. Insistence upon a single word and concept as the iron gate to be unlocked is also a mere moment, though an inalienable one. To be known, the inwardness to which cognition clings and expression always needs its own outwardness as well. Tradition and knowledge. In the mainstream of modern philosophy we can no longer, pardon the odious word, be in the swim. The hitherto dominant philosophy of the modern age wants to eliminate the traditional moments of thinking. It would dehistoricize the contents of thought and assign history to a special, fact-gathering branch of science. Ever since the fundament of knowledge came to be sought in supposedly immediate subjective data, men have been enthralled by the idol of a pure present. They would endeavor to strip thought of its historic dimension. The fictitious, one-dimensional now became the cognitive ground of all inner meaning. On this point there is agreement between patriarchs of modernity who are officially considered antipodes, between Descartes' autobiographical statements on the origin of his method and Bacon's idol theory. What is historic in thought, instead of heeding the timelessness of unobjectified logic, was equated with superstition, and to cite ecclesiastically institutional traditions against inquiring thought was indeed superstition. Men had every reason to criticize authority, but their critique misconceived that tradition is immanent in knowledge itself, that it serves to mediate between known objects. Knowledge no sooner starts starts from scratch, by way of a stabilizing objectification, then it will distort the objects. Knowledge as such, even in a form detached from substance, takes part in tradition as unconscious remembrance. There is no question which we might simply ask, without knowing of past things that are preserved in the question and spur it. From the outset, thinking as an intratemporal, motivated, progressive motion is the microcosmic equivalent of the macrocosmic motion of history that was internalized in the structure of thinking. Among the achievements of Kantian deduction, one ranging foremost is that even in the pure cognitive form, in the unity of the I think at the stage of imaginative reproduction, Kant perceived remembrance, the trace of historicity, because there is no time without its content. However, that which Husserl in his late phase called inner historicity cannot remain internal, a pure form. The inner historicity of thought is inseparable from its content, and thus inseparable from tradition. The pure, perfectly sublimated subject, on the other hand, would be absolutely devoid of tradition. A knowledge wholly conforming to the ideal of that purity, of total timelessness, a knowledge coincident with formal logic, would become a tautology. There would be no more room in it even for transcendental logic. Timelessness, the goal which the bourgeois mind may be pursuing in order to compensate for its own mortality, is the acme of its delusion. Benjamin innovated this when he strictly forswore the ideal of autonomy and submitted his thought to tradition, although to a voluntarily installed, subjectively chosen tradition that is as unauthoritative as it accuses the autarkic thought of being. Although reflecting the transcendental moment, the traditional moment is quasi-transcendental. It is not a point like subjectivity but a properly constitutive factor, what Kant called the mechanism hidden in the depths of the soul. There is one variant that should not be missing from the excessively narrow initial questions in the critique of pure reason, and that is the question how thinking obliged to relinquish tradition might preserve and transform tradition. 16 For this and nothing else is a mental experience. It was plumbed by Bergson in philosophy, and even more by Proust in the novel, though both men were kept under the spell of immediacy by their disgust with the bourgeois timelessness that will use conceptual mechanics to anticipate the end of life. Yet philosophy's methexis in tradition would only be a definite denial of tradition. Philosophy rests on the texts it criticizes. They are brought to it by the tradition they embody, and it is in dealing with them that the conduct of philosophy becomes commensurable with tradition. This justifies the move from philosophy to exegesis, which exalts neither the interpretation nor the symbol into an absolute but seeks the truth where thinking secularizes the irretrievable archetype of sacred texts. Rhetoric, in its dependence, patent or latent, on texts, philosophy admits its linguistic nature which the ideal of the method leads it to deny in vain. Like tradition, this nature has been tabooed in recent philosophical history, as rhetoric, severed and degraded into a means to achieve effects. It became the carrier of the line philosophy. In despising rhetoric, philosophy atoned for a guilt incurred ever since antiquity by its detachment from things, a guilt already pointed out by Plato. But the persecutors of the rhetorical element that saved expression for thought did just as much for the technification of thought, for its potential abolition, as did those who cultivated rhetoric and ignored the object. In philosophy, rhetoric represents that which cannot be thought except in language. It holds a place among the postulates of contents already known and fixed. Rhetoric is in jeopardy, like any substitute, because it may easily come to usurp what the thought cannot obtain directly from the presentation. It is incessantly corrupted by persuasive purposes, without which, on the other hand, the thought act would no longer have a practical relation. The fact that all approved traditional philosophy from Plato down to the semanticists has been allergic to expression. This fact accords with a propensity of all enlightenment to punish and disciplined gestures. It is a tray extending all the way to logic, a defense mechanism of the materialized consciousness. The alliance of philosophy and science aims at the virtual abolition of language and thus of philosophy, and yet philosophy cannot survive without the linguistic effort. Instead of splashing around in the linguistic cascade, a philosopher reflects upon it. There is a reason why sloppy language, inexactness, scientifically speaking, tends to be leagued with the scientific meme of incorruptibility by language. For to abolish language in thought is not to demythologize thought. Along with language, philosophy would blindly sacrifice whatever is not merely significative in dealing with its object. It is in language alone that like knows like. Yet we cannot ignore the perpetual denunciation of rhetoric by nominalists to whom a name bears no resemblance to what it says, nor can an unbroken rhetoric be summoned against them. Dialectics, literally, language as the organ of thought, would mean to attempt a critical rescue of the rhetorical element, a mutual approximation of thing and expression, to the point where the difference fades. Dialectics appropriates for the power of thought what historically seemed to be a flaw in thinking, its link with language, which nothing can wholly break. It was this link that inspired phenomenology to try, naively, as always, to make sure of truth by analyzing words. It is in the rhetorical quality that culture, society, and tradition animate the thought. A stern hostility to it is leagued with barbarism, in which bourgeois thinking ends. The vilification of Cicero and even Hegel's aversion to Diderot bear witness to the resentment of those whom the trials of life have robbed of the freedom to stand tall, and who regard the body of language as sinful. In dialectics, contrary to popular opinion, the rhetorical element is on the side of content. Dialectics seeks to mediate between random views and unessential accuracy, to master this dilemma by way of the formal, logical dilemma. But dialectics inclines to content because the content is not closed, not predetermined by a skeleton. It is a protest against mythology. Mythical is that which never changes, ultimately diluted to a formal legality of thought. To want substance in cognition is to want a utopia. It is this consciousness of possibility that sticks to the concrete, the undisfigured. Utopia is blocked off by possibility, never by immediate reality. This is why it seems abstract in the midst of extant things. The inextinguishable color comes from non-being. Thought is its servant, a piece of existence extending, however negatively, to that which is not. The utmost distance alone would be proximity. Philosophy is the prism in which its color is caught. Part 1. Relation to ontology. 1.